Hello and welcome back to the channel. Tonight we travel to the sun-drenched shores of North Africa, to a city that once commanded the Mediterranean with a fleet so vast it darkened the waters, to a civilization that built an empire on trade and ambition, and to a people whose very name became synonymous with both brilliance and betrayal. We will explore the rise of Carthage, a merchant republic that grew from a humble colony into a superpower. We will witness the genius of their naval innovations, the audacity of their generals, and the resilience of a culture that refused to bow to any master. We will sail alongside their purple-sailed ships to distant shores, walk through markets overflowing with ivory and gold, and stand on the walls as the greatest armies of the ancient world came to tear them down. And we will follow their story to its tragic and terrible end, when the flames consumed not just a city, but the memory of an entire civilization. Before we begin, if you enjoy these deep explorations of history, a like and a subscription would mean a great deal to me. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel and help these stories reach more people. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. Are you listening as the sun sets over your city, or perhaps in the quiet hours before dawn? Let me know in the comments below, and now settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to a time of stone harbours and bronze-beaked warships, of merchant princes and mercenary armies, of a city that dared to challenge Rome itself. Tonight, we journey to ancient Carthage. The story of Carthage begins not in Africa, but across the Mediterranean, in the ancient ports of the Levantine coast. In the cities of Tyre and Sidon, the Phoenicians had mastered an art that would change the world. They were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They didn't march vast armies across continents or carve empires from stone and blood. Instead, they built something far more subtle and far more enduring. They built a network, a web of trade routes, colonial outposts, and commercial alliances that stretched from the shores of modern-day Lebanon to the Pillars of Hercules and beyond. They were the merchants of the ancient world, and their ships, with their distinctive curved prows and blood-red sails, were the carriers of civilization itself. The Phoenicians were driven by a simple geographic reality. Their homeland was narrow, a thin strip of fertile coast pressed between the mountains and the sea. There was not enough land to sustain a growing population through agriculture alone, so they turned to the water. They became sailors, traders, and explorers. They ventured where others feared to go, navigating by the stars and the currents, mapping coastlines that existed only in rumour and myth. And wherever they went, they established small settlements, trading posts that served as stepping stones across the vast expanse of the Mediterranean. These were not grand colonial projects in the style of later empires. They were pragmatic, commercial ventures, a harbour, a warehouse, a temple to the gods who protected sailors, a place where goods could be exchanged, ships could be repaired, and news from distant lands could be gathered. But the Phoenician world was not destined to last forever. By the 9th century before the Common Era, new powers were rising in the east. The Assyrians, a brutal and efficient military machine, were expanding outward from Mesopotamia, swallowing kingdoms and cities in their path. The Phoenician homeland was under threat. Tyre, the greatest of the Phoenician cities, was besieged. Its people were pressed. And so, a decision was made, a decision that would echo through the centuries and reshape the destiny of the Mediterranean world. The Tyrians would send out a new colony, not as a temporary trading post, but as a permanent city, a new Tyre across the sea, a place that could endure even if the homeland fell. This colony was to be established on the northern coast of Africa, on a peninsula that jutted into the sea near the modern city of Tunis. The site was chosen with the meticulous care of experienced mariners and merchants. It had a natural harbour, easily defensible yet open to the major trade routes of the central Mediterranean. It was close to Sicily, to Sardinia, to the Iberian coast. It was positioned at the narrowest point of the Mediterranean, the perfect location for a city that intended to control the flow of goods between east and west. And it was fertile. The land was rich, capable of supporting agriculture and providing fresh water. In every practical sense, it was an ideal location for a city. And so, In the year that tradition places at 814 BCE, though the exact date remains shrouded in legend, a fleet departed from Tyre. At its head was a woman whose name would become the founding myth of a great civilization. Her name was Alyssa, though history would remember her by another name, Dido. The story of Dido and the founding of Carthage is one of the great legends of the ancient world, recorded centuries later by Roman poets and historians who both admired and despised the city she created. According to the legend, Alyssa was a Phoenician princess, the daughter of the king of Tyre. When her husband, a high priest of the temple of Melkart, was murdered by her brother Pygmalion in a plot to seize his wealth, Alyssa fled. She gathered loyal followers, took her husband's treasure, and set sail westward. She was not just a refugee, she was a woman of intelligence and ambition, determined to carve out a new destiny far from the treachery of Tyre. When her fleet arrived at the African coast, she approached the local Berber king and negotiated for land. The king, perhaps amused by this foreign woman's audacity, agreed to sell her only as much land as could be covered by the hide of a single ox. It seemed a cruel joke, a pittance. But Alyssa was clever. She took the ox hide and cut it into the thinnest possible strips, then laid them end to end in a vast circle that encompassed the entire peninsula. The king, bound by his word and perhaps impressed by her ingenuity, granted her the land. And on that land, Alyssa built Carthage. The city's name, Carthage in the Phoenician tongue, meant simply new city. It was a new Tyre, a new beginning. But the legend does not end there. The story takes a darker turn, one that would become a favourite of Roman poets centuries later. The Berber king, Iarbas, became infatuated with Alyssa and demanded her hand in marriage. She refused. She had sworn an oath of fidelity to her dead husband and she would not break it, but Iarbas threatened a war if she did not submit. Alyssa, caught between her vow and the survival of her people, made a choice that transformed her from founder to martyr. She agreed to a ceremony. A great pyre was built, ostensibly for a sacrifice to appease the gods. But when the flames were lit, Alyssa climbed atop the pyre and threw herself into the fire, choosing death over dishonour. Her people mourned her, and she was elevated to the status of a goddess. The Romans would later call her Dido, and they would weave her story into their own mythology, most famously in Virgil's Aeneid, where she falls in love with the Trojan hero Aeneas, only to be abandoned by him as he sails on to found Rome. In Virgil's telling, her death is not just a personal tragedy, but a cosmic one, a moment that plants the seeds of eternal enmity between Carthage and Rome. But we must be careful here. The story of Dido, as beautiful and tragic as it is legend, not history. It was written down centuries after the events it purports to describe, shaped and reshaped by poets and propagandists to serve their own purposes. The Romans used it to justify their hatred of Carthage, to frame the conflict between the two powers as a destiny written in the stars, a revenge for a broken heart. But what can we actually know about the founding of Carthage? What does the archaeological record tell us? The truth is at once simpler and more complex. The archaeological evidence confirms that a Phoenician settlement was established on the site of Carthage around the end of the 9th century or the beginning of the 8th century BCE, roughly in line with the traditional founding date. The earliest remains include pottery, tools, and the foundations of simple structures. This was not yet the great metropolis it would become. It was a small colony, one of dozens that the Phoenicians established across the Mediterranean. But it was well positioned, and it grew. Over the following centuries, Carthage expanded, absorbing the surrounding territory, fortifying its harbour, and establishing itself as a major centre of trade. It became not just a colony of Tyre, but a power in its own right. And when Tyre and the other Phoenician cities of the Levant were finally conquered by the Assyrians, and later by the Babylonians and the Persians, Carthage did not fall with them. It endured. It became the heir to the Phoenician legacy, the greatest of the Western Phoenician cities, the capital of a new maritime empire. To understand how Carthage rose to such power, we must first understand what Carthage was. It was not like Rome. It was not a city built on conquest and territorial expansion, at least not at first. Carthage was a merchant republic, a thalassocracy, a state whose power rested not on the strength of its legions, but on the reach of its fleet. The Carthaginians were traders above all else. They bought and sold, they transported, they connected distant markets and extracted profit from the flow of goods. Their ships carried grain from Sicily, silver from Spain, tin from Britain, ivory from Africa, glass from the Levant, and slaves from everywhere. They established trading posts and colonies across the western Mediterranean and beyond, from the coast of modern-day Tunisia and Libya to the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and the Balearics, to the southern shores of Spain, and even, according to some accounts, down the west coast of Africa, and perhaps as far as the misty islands of Britain and the amber coasts of the north. The Carthaginian economy was built on control. Control of trade routes, control of key resources, control of strategic ports, and above all, control of the sea. The Carthaginian navy was the instrument of this control, and it was the most formidable naval force the ancient world had yet seen. At its height, Carthage could deploy hundreds of warships, sleek and deadly quinqueremes and triremes, propelled by the synchronized oars of skilled rowers and armed with bronze rams designed to shatter the hulls of enemy vessels. These ships were crewed not just by Carthaginian citizens, but by professional sailors drawn from across the Mediterranean, men who knew every current, every wind, every hidden reef and safe harbour. The Carthaginians guarded the secrets of their maritime dominance jealously. They did not publish maps or sailing directions. They did not welcome foreign ships into their waters. Vessels that strayed too close to Carthaginian trade routes or colonial holdings were warned off, and if they did not heed the warning, they were sunk. The Carthaginians were not interested in sharing the sea. They intended to own it. This economic model made Carthage extraordinarily wealthy. The city itself became a wonder of the ancient world, a sprawling metropolis of stone and marble, of towering walls and densely packed neighbourhoods, of temples and markets and warehouses overflowing with the goods of 3 continents. At its peak, Carthage may have been home to as many as 400,000 people, making it one of the largest cities on Earth. Its ports were marvels of engineering. The city had 2 harbours, a rectangular commercial harbour where merchant ships docked to load and unload their cargoes, and a circular military harbour hidden behind high walls where the warships of the Carthaginian navy were kept. This military harbour, known as the Cothon, was a masterpiece of design. It was a perfectly round basin, large enough to hold over 200 ships, with a central island in the middle that housed the admiral's headquarters. From this island, the admiral could survey the entire fleet, and shipwrights could repair and maintain the vessels in covered sheds that protected them from the elements and from prying eyes. Even today the remains of the Cothon are visible, a silent testament to the ingenuity of Carthaginian engineers. But wealth alone does not make a civilization. Carthage was more than just a city of merchants and sailors. It was a complex society with its own distinct culture, its own religious beliefs, its own political system. The Carthaginians spoke Punic, a dialect of the Phoenician language, written in the same script that had given rise to the alphabets of the Greeks and Romans. They worshipped a pantheon of gods inherited from their Phoenician ancestors, chief among them Baal Hammon, the lord of the sky and the storm, and Tanit, the goddess of fertility, the moon, and the protector of the city. The religion of Carthage was ancient and solemn, marked by rituals that seem strange and disturbing to modern eyes. The Carthaginians practiced animal sacrifice on a grand scale, and according to both Greek and Roman sources, they also practiced child sacrifice, offering their own sons and daughters to the gods in times of crisis or to fulfill vows. This practice, if it indeed occurred as described, was carried out in a sacred precinct known as the Tophet, where the remains of thousands of cremated infants and young children have been discovered by archaeologists. The evidence is controversial and debated, but it suggests that the Carthaginians, or at least some of them, believed that the gods demanded the most precious offering of all in exchange for their favour. The political structure of Carthage was unique in the ancient world. It was not a monarchy, though it had kings in its earliest days. It was not a democracy in the Athenian sense, though it had elements of popular participation. It was an oligarchic republic, a system in which power was held by a wealthy elite, but checked and balanced by various institutions. At the top of the government were two elected magistrates known as suffetes, roughly equivalent to the Roman consuls. The suffes were elected annually by the citizen body, and they served as the chief executives of the state, presiding over the Senate and leading the military. Below the suffes was the Senate, a body of several hundred members drawn from the aristocracy, men who had proven themselves in commerce or warfare, and who possessed the wealth and influence to shape policy. The Senate debated matters of war and peace, negotiated treaties, and oversaw the administration of the empire. But there was also a popular assembly in which all male citizens could participate. The assembly had the power to vote on certain matters, particularly if the Senate and the suffes disagreed. This system was not perfect. It was dominated by a few powerful families, and corruption was endemic. But it was also remarkably stable. Carthage avoided the civil wars and coups that plagued so many other ancient states. Power passed peacefully from one administration to the next. The system worked, and it worked for centuries. The military power of Carthage was built on two pillars. The first was the navy, which we have already discussed. The second was the army. But here Carthage was different from nearly every other ancient power. The Carthaginians did not, for the most part, fight their own wars. They hired others to do it for them. The Carthaginian army was not an army of citizen soldiers, but an army of mercenaries, professional warriors drawn from across the Mediterranean and beyond. There were Libyans from the African interior, fierce and reliable infantry, who formed the backbone of Carthaginian land forces. There were Numidians, the legendary light cavalry of North Africa, whose horsemen could ride without saddles or stirrups, and whose javelins were deadly at range. There were Iberians from Spain, armed with short swords and oval shields, tough and disciplined. There were Gauls from beyond the Alps, towering warriors who fought with reckless courage and whose swords could cleave through armour and bone. There were Balearic slingers, whose accuracy with a sling was unmatched in the ancient world, and Greek hoplites, professional soldiers who fought in the traditional phalanx formation. This was the Carthaginian army, a polyglot force of hired swords, bound together not by patriotism or ideology, but by pay and the hope of plunder. It was a system that had both strengths and weaknesses. The strength was that Carthage could field enormous armies without risking the lives of its own citizens. The Carthaginian elite could focus on commerce and politics while leaving the messy business of warfare to professionals. The army was also incredibly diverse and flexible. A Carthaginian general had at his disposal infantry, cavalry, skirmishers and specialists of every type, and he could tailor his forces to the specific demands of each campaign. The weakness was that mercenaries fight for money, not for love of country. They could be unreliable. They could mutiny if their pay was late. They could switch sides if offered a better deal, and they had no intrinsic loyalty to Carthage itself. A Carthaginian general had to be not just a tactician, but a diplomat, a psychologist, a man who could hold together a fractious coalition of warriors who often spoke different languages and worshipped different gods. It was a difficult task, and it required a special kind of genius. Carthage would produce several such men, generals whose names would become legendary, but none would be greater than Hannibal Barca. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand Hannibal, we must first understand how Carthage came to dominate the Western Mediterranean and how it came into conflict with the rising power of Rome. For the first several centuries of its existence, Carthage faced no serious rivals. The Greeks had established colonies in Sicily and southern Italy, but they were divided into competing city-states, often at war with one another. The Etruscans controlled much of central Italy, but they were a land power, not a maritime one. The Romans were still a minor city-state struggling to dominate the other tribes of Latium. Carthage, meanwhile, was expanding steadily, establishing new colonies, signing treaties with local rulers, and slowly but surely extending its web of trade and influence across the Western Sea. The first major challenge to Carthaginian dominance came not from Rome, but from the Greeks. In Sicily, the Greek city-states were wealthy and powerful, and they had ambitions of their own. The eastern half of the island was dominated by Greek colonies such as Syracuse, Gela, and Acragas, while the western half was under Carthaginian control. For much of the 6th and 5th centuries, the two spheres coexisted uneasily, punctuated by occasional wars. The Greeks viewed the Carthaginians as barbarians, outsiders who did not share their language or culture. The Carthaginians viewed the Greeks as rivals and threats to their commercial interests. The conflict came to a head in 480 BCE, the same year that the Greeks faced the Persian invasion at Thermopylae and Salamis. In Sicily, a massive Carthaginian army under the general Hamilcar landed on the island and laid siege to the Greek city of Himera. The Greeks, led by the tyrant Gelon of Syracuse, met the Carthaginians in battle. It was a brutal and decisive engagement. The Carthaginian army was destroyed, and Hamilcar himself was killed, either in battle or by his own hand to avoid capture. The defeat was a humiliation for Carthage, and it marked the beginning of a long and bitter struggle for control of Sicily, a struggle that would last for nearly 3 centuries and would eventually draw in Rome. But Carthage recovered. It always recovered. That was one of the defining characteristics of the Carthaginian state. It was resilient, adaptable, willing to absorb losses and learn from them. After Himera, Carthage pulled back from Sicily for several decades, focusing instead on consolidating its holdings in North Africa and Spain. But it did not forget. In 409 BCE, a new Carthaginian general, Hannibal Mago, the grandson of the Hamilcar who had died at Himera, launched a new invasion of Sicily. This time, the Carthaginians were better prepared and better led. Hannibal Mago besieged and destroyed Himera, the city that had humiliated his grandfather, and he offered human sacrifices to the gods on the very spot where Hamilcar had fallen. It was an act of brutal vengeance, but it was also a message. Carthage had returned, and it would not be denied. Over the next century, Carthage and the Greek cities of Sicily fought an exhausting series of wars, with territory and cities changing hands repeatedly. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory. The conflict became a stalemate, a grinding war of attrition that drained the resources and manpower of both sides. During this period, Carthage was also expanding its empire in other directions. In North Africa, the Carthaginians extended their control over the Libyan and Berber tribes of the interior, extracting tribute and recruiting soldiers. The agricultural hinterland of Carthage, the territory directly controlled by the city, became one of the most productive regions in the ancient world, exporting vast quantities of grain, olive oil and wine. In Spain, Carthage established a series of colonies and trading posts along the southern and eastern coasts, drawn by the immense mineral wealth of the Iberian Peninsula. The silver mines of Spain were particularly valuable, providing Carthage with the precious metal it needed to mint coins, pay its mercenaries, and finance its wars. The Carthaginian presence in Spain was not just commercial, but military and political. The Carthaginians allied with local Iberian tribes, married into their ruling families, and gradually extended their influence inland. Spain would become the jewel of the Carthaginian Empire, a source of wealth and manpower that would sustain the state through its greatest trials. And then, in the 3rd century BCE, a new power appeared on the horizon: Rome. The Romans had spent the previous 2 centuries conquering the Italian peninsula, absorbing or subjugating the other tribes and city-states one by one. By 270 BCE, Rome controlled all of Italy south of the Po River, and it had become the dominant power in the central Mediterranean. The Romans were not merchants or sailors. They were soldiers, farmers who could be called up to fight in times of war, and who returned to their fields when the war was over. The Roman army was a citizen militia, disciplined and well-trained, organised into legions that could manoeuvre with flexibility on the battlefield. The Romans had little interest in trade or naval power, but they were intensely interested in land, in security, and in the expansion of their territory. And now, having conquered Italy, they looked across the narrow strait that separated the peninsula from Sicily. They saw a wealthy island divided between Greek cities and Carthaginian holdings, an island that seemed ripe for the taking. The Romans did not yet understand that by reaching across that strait, they were about to collide with an empire that had ruled the Western Sea for centuries. They were about to start a conflict that would last for more than a century, a conflict that would be fought across 3 continents, and would end with the complete and utter destruction of one of the two. Rivals. The stage was set for the Punic Wars. The First Punic War began, as so many wars do, almost by accident. In 264 BCE, a group of mercenaries known as the Mamertines, who had seized control of the city of Messana on the northeastern tip of Sicily, found themselves under attack by the forces of Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city on the island. The Mamertines, desperate for help, appealed to both Carthage and Rome. Carthage responded first, sending a garrison to protect Messana and prevent Syracuse from gaining control of the strategically vital city. But the Mamertines, perhaps fearing that the Carthaginians would never leave, then turned to Rome and asked for their help as well. The Romans debated the matter in the Senate. On the one hand, the Mamertines were little better than bandits, and helping them was morally dubious. On the other hand, Messana controlled the strait between Italy and Sicily, and allowing Carthage to dominate the city would give the Carthaginians a foothold dangerously close to the Italian mainland. The Romans decided to intervene. They sent an army across the strait, and the Carthaginians, outmanoeuvred and outnumbered, withdrew their garrison. It was a small incident, a minor diplomatic and military skirmish, but it was the spark that ignited a war that would last for 23 years and would transform both Rome and Carthage forever. The First Punic War was unlike any conflict the ancient world had yet seen. It was a total war, a struggle for dominance that mobilized the full resources of both states. And it was, above all, a naval war. Rome, a land power with little naval experience, would have to build a fleet and learn to fight at sea if it hoped to defeat Carthage. The Carthaginians, confident in their maritime supremacy, must have viewed the Roman challenge with a mixture of amusement and contempt. What did these Latin farmers know of the sea? But the Romans were fast learners, and they were nothing if not determined. According to the Roman historians, the Romans acquired their first warships by copying a Carthaginian king-careme that had run aground on the Italian coast. Roman engineers studied the vessel, measured every plank and joint, and then set about constructing an entire fleet based on the design. It was an audacious plan, and it worked. Within a matter of months, Rome had built over 100 warships, a fleet that could challenge Carthage on its own element. But building ships was one thing. Knowing how to use them was another. The Romans were inexperienced sailors, and their crews were clumsy and slow compared to the veteran Carthaginian sailors, who had spent their entire lives on the water. The Romans needed an edge, some tactical innovation that would offset Carthaginian skill. They found it in a device called the corvus, a boarding bridge. The corvus was a long plank with a heavy spike on the underside mounted on a pivot at the bow of the ship. When a Roman ship came alongside an enemy vessel, the corvus could be dropped, and the spike would drive into the deck of the enemy ship, locking the two vessels together. Roman soldiers could then charge across the bridge and turn the naval battle into a land battle, a type of combat where Roman legionaries excelled. It was a brutally simple innovation, and it was devastatingly effective. In 260 BCE, the Roman and Carthaginian fleets met in battle off the northern coast of Sicily, near the town of Mylae. The Carthaginians, confident in their superior seamanship, advanced to attack. But when the Roman ships deployed their corvus bridges and locked the two fleets together, the Carthaginian advantage evaporated. Roman legionaries poured onto the Carthaginian decks, and the battle became a massacre. The Romans captured or destroyed over 50 Carthaginian ships and killed thousands of sailors. It was Rome's first major naval victory, and it sent shockwaves through the Mediterranean. Rome, the land power, had defeated Carthage at sea. The balance of power was shifting. The war dragged on for over 2 decades, a grinding conflict of sieges, raids, and naval battles. The fighting took place primarily in Sicily, but also in North Africa, Sardinia, and the waters between. Both sides suffered enormous losses. Entire fleets were destroyed by storms. Armies were annihilated in battle or succumbed to disease. The financial cost was staggering. Rome, with its vast reserves of Italian manpower, could absorb the losses and keep fighting. Carthage, dependent on its wealth and its ability to hire mercenaries, found the war increasingly difficult to sustain. The Carthaginian navy, once the undisputed master of the sea, was slowly worn down by repeated defeats and the relentless Roman shipbuilding program. By 242 BCE, Carthage was exhausted. The city's treasury was empty. The fleet was a shadow of its former self, and the Roman blockade of the western tip of Sicily, where the last Carthaginian strongholds held out, was tightening. In 241 BCE, the Carthaginians made one last attempt to break the Roman blockade and resupply their forces in Sicily. They assembled a fleet of around 200 ships, loaded with supplies and reinforcements, and sailed for Sicily. The Romans, with a fleet of similar size, intercepted them near the Aegates Islands, off the western coast of Sicily. The battle was swift and decisive. The Carthaginian fleet, heavily laden with cargo and poorly trained crews, was no match for the lighter, more manoeuvrable Roman ships. The Romans sank or captured over 120 Carthaginian vessels. The Carthaginian admiral was killed, and the survivors fled back to Africa. It was the end. Carthage had no more ships, no more money, and no more will to fight. The Carthaginian government sued for peace. The terms of the peace treaty were harsh. Carthage was forced to abandon Sicily entirely, ceding the island to Rome. Carthage was also required to pay a massive war indemnity, 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years, a sum that would cripple the Carthaginian economy for a generation, and Carthage was forbidden from waging war against any of Rome's allies without Roman permission. It was a humiliating defeat, the first major military loss in Carthaginian history, but it was not, the Carthaginians believed, a fatal one. Carthage had lost Sicily, but it still controlled its African territories, its possessions in Spain, and its trading network. The city could recover. It had recovered before. What Carthage did not yet realise was that Rome was not a rival that could be bought off or negotiated with in the traditional manner of Mediterranean politics. Rome was different. Rome was relentless, and Rome would not be satisfied until Carthage was destroyed. The immediate aftermath of the First Punic War nearly destroyed Carthage from within. The Carthaginian government, desperate to reduce costs, attempted to disband its mercenary army without paying the soldiers all of the wages they were owed. The mercenaries, who had fought and bled for Carthage for over 2 decades, were outraged. They had been promised payment, and now they were being told that there was no money. The situation escalated rapidly. The mercenaries camped outside Carthage refused to disband. They armed themselves and began to march on the city, gathering support from the Libyan and Berber subjects of Carthage, who had their own grievances against the heavy taxation and harsh rule of the Carthaginian elite. What began as a labour dispute became a full-scale rebellion, a war that threatened to tear apart the Carthaginian Empire from within. This conflict, known as the Mercenary War or the Truceless War, was one of the most brutal and savage conflicts of the ancient world. Both sides committed atrocities. Prisoners were tortured and mutilated. Cities were sacked and burned. The rebels even crucified a Carthaginian general and his staff. Carthage itself was besieged, cut off from its agricultural hinterland and facing starvation. The man who saved Carthage was a general named Hamilcar Barca. Hamilcar had been one of the most successful Carthaginian commanders in the First Punic War, the man who had held out in western Sicily long after the rest of the island had fallen. He was a veteran, a skilled tactician, and a man of immense personal charisma. The Carthaginian government gave him command of the forces defending the city, and tasked him with crushing the rebellion. Hamilcar did not have a large army, but he used what he had with ruthless efficiency. He divided the rebel forces, played their leaders against one another, and defeated them piecemeal. He showed no mercy. Captured rebels were executed, often in brutal and public fashion, as a warning to others. Slowly, painfully, Hamilcar ground down the rebellion. It took 3 years, but by 238 BCE, the mercenary war was over. Carthage had survived, but the cost had been enormous. Thousands had died, the economy was shattered, and the city's African territories had been devastated. But even as Carthage struggled to recover from the mercenary war, Rome struck another blow. Taking advantage of Carthaginian weakness, the Romans seized the islands of Sardinia and Corsica, which had been Carthaginian possessions for centuries. The Romans claimed that Carthage had been preparing to attack Roman merchants, a transparent pretext, and threatened war if Carthage resisted. Carthage, still reeling from the mercenary war and in no position to fight, was forced to accept the loss. Rome demanded an additional indemnity of 1,100 talents of silver as the price of peace. It was an act of naked aggression, a violation of the treaty that had ended the First Punic War, and it was a humiliation that the Carthaginians would not forget. The loss of Sardinia and Corsica was in many ways more significant than the loss of Sicily. It demonstrated that Rome could take what it wanted, whenever it wanted, and that Carthage was powerless to stop them. The Carthaginian elite, the senators and suffets who had spent their lives building and maintaining the empire, looked at the map and realized that their world was shrinking. If Carthage was to survive, it would need to find a new source of wealth and power, a new base from which to rebuild. They turned their eyes westward, to Spain. Spain would become the salvation of Carthage and the launching pad for its revenge against Rome, and the man who would transform Spain into a Carthaginian stronghold was Hamilcar Barca, the hero of the mercenary war. In 237 BCE, Hamilcar was appointed to lead a military expedition to Spain. His mission was to expand Carthaginian control over the Iberian Peninsula, to secure the silver mines, and to recruit a new army from the fierce Iberian tribes. Hamilcar brought with him his young son, a boy of 9 years old, whose name was Hannibal. According to legend, before departing for Spain, Hamilcar brought Hannibal to the temple of Baal Hammon and made the boy swear an oath. The boy placed his hand on the altar, and he swore that he would never be a friend to Rome, that he would be Rome's enemy for as long as he lived. Whether this story is true or not, we cannot know. It was recorded by Roman historians centuries later, and it may be propaganda, a way to frame Hannibal as a monster who had been twisted from childhood into an instrument of hatred. But what is undeniable is that Hannibal Barca grew up in a world defined by conflict with Rome, raised by a father who had dedicated his life to restoring Carthaginian power, and he absorbed those lessons deeply. Hamilcar's campaign in Spain was a masterpiece of military and diplomatic strategy. He did not simply conquer, he built alliances. He married into local Iberian nobility, cementing ties with the native tribes. He founded new cities, including the settlement that would become Acraluc, modern-day Alicante. He trained a new army, blending Carthaginian officers with Iberian infantry and cavalry, creating a force that was both loyal and formidable. And he exploited the silver mines with ruthless efficiency, sending vast quantities of precious metal back to Carthage. Within a few years, the revenues from Spain had revitalized the Carthaginian economy. The war indemnity to Rome was paid off. The treasury was full once more. And Carthage, which had seemed on the verge of collapse, was again a major power. But Hamilcar did not live to see his work completed. In 228 BCE, during a campaign against an Iberian tribe, Hamilcar was killed in battle. Some accounts say he drowned while crossing a river, sacrificing himself to allow his sons to escape. His death was a blow to Carthage, but his vision did not die with him. Command in Spain passed to Hamilcar's son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, who continued the policies of expansion and consolidation. Hasdrubal was more of a diplomat than a warrior, and he preferred negotiation to battle. He founded the city of New Carthage, Carthage in Punic, modern Cartagena, on the southeastern coast of Spain. The city was positioned near some of the richest silver mines in the region, and it quickly became the capital of the Carthaginian territories in Iberia, a centre of administration, commerce and military power. Hasdrubal also negotiated a treaty with Rome, known as the Ebro Treaty, which established the Ebro River in northeastern Spain as the boundary between the Roman and Carthaginian spheres of influence. Carthage agreed not to expand north of the Ebro, and Rome, implicitly, recognised Carthaginian dominance south of it. It was a diplomatic success, a way to avoid another war while Carthage rebuilt its strength. But Hasdrubal, like Hamilcar before him, did not live long. In 221 BCE, he was assassinated by a Celtic slave, a personal vendetta unrelated to politics. With Hasdrubal's death, the question arose of who would lead the Carthaginian forces in Spain. The soldiers, the veterans who had fought under Hamilcar and Hasdrubal, made the choice themselves. They acclaimed Hamilcar's eldest son, a young man of 25 who had spent his entire adult life in military camps and on battlefields. They chose Hannibal Barti, Hannibal Barca. The name alone evokes images of elephants crossing the Alps, of Roman legions shattered on blood-soaked fields, of a general who came closer than anyone before or since to destroying the Roman Republic. Hannibal is one of the most famous military commanders in history, and his legend has only grown over the centuries. But who was he? What kind of man could conceive of a strategy so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that it would be remembered for over 2,000 years? The historical sources on Hannibal are frustratingly incomplete. We have no Carthaginian records of his life, no writings in his own hand, no sympathetic biography written by a fellow Carthaginian. What we have are the accounts of his enemies, the Romans, who both feared and admired him. The Roman historians writing decades or centuries after the events painted Hannibal as a figure of almost mythic proportions, a genius and a monster, a man of superhuman skill and inhuman cruelty. They praised his tactical brilliance while condemning his character. They said he was treacherous, impious, capable of any deception or atrocity to achieve his goals. But we must read these accounts with caution. They were written by the victors, and they served a purpose. Rome needed to explain how it had been brought to the brink of destruction by a single man and his army. By portraying Hannibal as a demonic figure, they could justify their own suffering and their eventual revenge. What seems clear from the sources is that Hannibal was an extraordinary leader, a man who commanded absolute loyalty from his troops despite the incredible hardships he asked them to endure. He fought alongside his men, shared their dangers, and was often the first into battle and the last to leave the field. He was a master of languages, reportedly fluent in Punic, Greek, and several Iberian and Celtic dialects, able to speak directly to the diverse soldiers under his command. He was a student of Greek culture and military theory, and he travelled with Greek tutors and advisors, including a historian named Soslas who recorded his campaigns. He was physically imposing, said to be able to endure heat and cold with equal indifference, to go without food or sleep for days when necessary, and to ride and fight with a skill that impressed even the hardened cavalrymen of his army. And he was, above all, a tactician of genius, a man who could read a battlefield, anticipate his enemy's moves, and devise plans that turned the enemy's own strength against them. When Hannibal took command in Spain in 221 BCE, he was not content to simply maintain the status quo. He was his father's son, and he had inherited Hamilcar's ambition and his hatred of Rome. Hannibal spent the next 2 years consolidating Carthaginian control over Spain, subduing tribes that had rebelled or wavered in their loyalty, and building up his army. He recruited heavily from the Iberian tribes, training them in Carthaginian tactics and integrating them into his forces. He also began to plan for a much larger campaign, a campaign that would take the war to Rome itself. But he needed a pretext, a reason to break the fragile peace that had existed since the end of the First Punic War. He found it in the city of Saguntum. Saguntum was a city on the eastern coast of Spain, south of the Ebro River, and thus technically within the Carthaginian sphere of influence, as defined by the Ebro Treaty. But Saguntum had also placed itself under Roman protection, appealing to Rome for help in a dispute with neighbouring tribes. This created an ambiguous situation. Was Saguntum a Roman ally, protected by Roman power, or was it a city within Carthaginian territory, subject to Carthaginian authority? Hannibal decided to test the question. In 219 BCE, he laid siege to Saguntum. The siege lasted 8 months. The Saguntines fought desperately, appealing to Rome for aid, but the Romans, perhaps reluctant to provoke another war, debated and delayed. By the time they decided to send envoys to demand that Hannibal lift the siege, it was too late. Saguntum fell, and Hannibal's troops sacked the city. The Roman envoys travelled to Carthage and demanded that the Carthaginian government hand over Hannibal for punishment. The Carthaginian Senate, perhaps sensing an opportunity, perhaps genuinely believing that Hannibal had acted within his rights, refused. The Roman envoy, a man named Quintus Fabius, made a dramatic gesture. He gathered the folds of his toga and said, "Here we bring you peace and war. Take which you will." The Carthaginian suffet replied, "Give us which you please." Fabius let the folds of his toga fall and said, "Then we give you war." The Second Punic War had begun. But this war would be unlike the first. The First Punic War had been fought primarily at sea and on the island of Sicily. The Second Punic War would be fought on land, across the breadth of the Mediterranean world, and it would be defined by Hannibal's audacious strategy. Hannibal understood that Carthage could not defeat Rome in a war of attrition. Rome controlled Italy, a vast pool of manpower. Rome had allies across the Italian peninsula who would provide soldiers and supplies. If Carthage tried to fight Rome the way it had in the First Punic War, by building fleets and contesting naval supremacy, it would lose. Rome had already proven it could match Carthage at sea. Hannibal needed a different approach. He needed to take the fight to Italy itself, to invade the Roman heartland and shatter the Roman alliance system. If he could defeat the Roman armies in Italy, if he could convince Rome's Italian allies to defect to Carthage, then Rome would be isolated and vulnerable. It was a bold plan, perhaps even a mad one. But it had one enormous problem. How does one invade Italy? The sea route was controlled by the Roman navy. A Carthaginian invasion fleet would be intercepted and destroyed long before it reached the Italian coast. But there was another way, a land route through Spain, across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and over the Alps into northern Italy. It was a route that had never been attempted by an army. It was a route that seemed impossible, but Hannibal believed it could be done. In the spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal began his march. He left New Carthage at the head of an army that numbered, according to various ancient sources, somewhere between 90,000 and 100,000 men, along with thousands of cavalry and a corps of war elephants. The elephants were a symbol of Carthaginian military might, massive beasts trained for war, capable of smashing through enemy lines and terrifying soldiers who had never seen such creatures. Hannibal's army was a coalition, a polyglot force drawn from across the Carthaginian Empire. There were African troops, Libyans armed in the Greek fashion with long spears and heavy shields. There were Numidian cavalry, the finest light horsemen in the world. There were Iberians, tough infantry and skirmishers from the Spanish tribes. And there were officers and engineers from Carthage itself, men who had been trained in the Barcid tradition, loyal to Hannibal and his family. This was not a mercenary army in the way the Carthaginian armies of the First Punic War had been. This was Hannibal's army, forged in Spain, bound together by years of campaigning and by loyalty to their commander. The march north through Spain was not unopposed. Several Iberian tribes resisted, and Hannibal had to fight his way through. His army suffered casualties, and many of the Iberian troops, unwilling to leave their homeland for an indefinite campaign in distant lands, deserted. By the time Hannibal reached the Pyrenees, the mountain range that separates Spain from Gaul, his army had been reduced to perhaps 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry. But these were the veterans, the men who had chosen to follow Hannibal to the end. Hannibal crossed the Pyrenees and entered Gaul, the land of the Celtic tribes. Gaul was not a unified nation, but a patchwork of tribal territories, each ruled by its own chieftain. Some of these tribes were friendly to Carthage, having long-standing trade relationships or grievances against Rome. Others were hostile, seeing Hannibal's army as an invader. Hannibal had to negotiate, bribe, and sometimes fight his way through. The march through Gaul took weeks, and it was exhausting. The army followed the coast at first, then turned inland, following the Rhone River north. At the Rhone, Hannibal faced a major obstacle. The river was wide and fast-flowing, and the tribes on the far bank were preparing to contest the crossing. Hannibal devised a plan. He sent a detachment of troops upstream to cross at a narrower point, then come back downstream and attack the enemy from behind, while the main army crossed in boats and rafts. The plan worked. The enemy was caught between two forces and fled. The entire army, including the elephants, crossed the Rhone. It was a feat of engineering and coordination, and it demonstrated Hannibal's ability to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. But the greatest obstacle was yet to come: the Alps, the mountain range that separates Gaul from Italy, a wall of rock and ice that rises to heights of over 4,000 metres. No army had ever crossed the Alps in force. It was considered impossible. The passes were narrow and treacherous. The weather was unpredictable and deadly. The local tribes were hostile, but Hannibal had no choice. The passes would be open only for a few more weeks before the winter snows closed them. He had to move quickly. Hannibal chose a pass. The exact route is still debated by historians, and began the ascent. The march through the Alps is the stuff of legend, an ordeal that tested the limits of human endurance. The paths were narrow, barely wide enough for a single elephant. The slopes were steep and icy. Men and animals slipped and fell to their deaths. The local tribes, the Allobroges and others, ambushed the column, rolling boulders down on the Carthaginians and attacking the stragglers. Hannibal fought back, securing key positions and driving off the attackers, but the losses were severe. And then there was the cold. As the army climbed higher, the temperature dropped. Men who had grown up in the heat of Africa and Spain found themselves struggling through snow and ice. They had no proper winter clothing. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Some men simply lay down and refused to go on, and they froze where they fell. The elephants, creatures of the warm south, suffered terribly. Several died on the slopes. But Hannibal pushed on, always at the front, always visible to his troops, a figure of iron will. When the army reached the summit of the pass and looked down into the green plains of Italy stretching out below, Hannibal gathered his men and gave a speech. He pointed to Italy and told them that they had overcome the impossible, and that now nothing could stop them. Rome was within their grasp. The descent from the Alps was, if anything, more difficult than the ascent. The paths on the Italian side were even narrower and steeper. In one place, a landslide had destroyed the path entirely, and Hannibal's engineers had to build a new one, breaking through rock and filling in gaps. The ancient sources say that Hannibal used a combination of fire and vinegar to crack the rocks, heating them with bonfires and then pouring vinegar, a weak acid, on the heated stone to make it brittle. Whether this technique was actually used, or whether it is an embellishment added by later writers, we cannot know. But what is certain is that Hannibal's army, through sheer determination and engineering skill, made it through. 15 days after entering the Alps, Hannibal's army emerged into the Po River Valley in northern Italy. They had done the impossible, but the cost had been staggering. Hannibal's army, which had numbered perhaps 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry when it entered the Alps, was now reduced to fewer than 26,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. Half his force had been lost to battle, desertion, cold, and starvation. Nearly all of the elephants were dead or dying, and the survivors were exhausted, sick, and hungry. By any rational measure, the campaign should have ended there. The army was a shadow of what it had been. But Hannibal had reached Italy, and he was about to prove that he did not need overwhelming numbers to defeat Rome. He only needed his genius. Hannibal's first task was to rest and refit his army, and to recruit new troops. The Po Valley was inhabited by Celtic tribes, the Gauls of northern Italy, who had long been enemies of Rome. The Romans had conquered the region only a few decades earlier, and the Gauls resented Roman rule. Hannibal sent emissaries to the Gallic tribes, offering them alliance and the chance for revenge against Rome. The Gauls responded enthusiastically. Thousands of Gallic warriors flocked to Hannibal's banner. Within weeks, Hannibal had rebuilt his army, not to its former size, but large enough to fight. And the Romans were coming. The Roman Senate, upon hearing that Hannibal had actually crossed the Alps, had been stunned. They had expected the war to be fought in Spain, and they had sent armies there. But now the war had come to Italy. The Romans recalled one of the armies, led by the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, and ordered it to intercept Hannibal. Scipio, an experienced general who had already clashed with Hannibal's forces in Spain, moved quickly. He caught up with Hannibal near the Ticinus River, a tributary of the Po. The two armies met in a cavalry skirmish. Hannibal's Numidian horsemen, light and fast, easily outmaneuvered the heavier Roman cavalry. Scipio himself was wounded in the fighting, and was saved from death only by the intervention of his teenage son, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would later become famous as Scipio Africanus, the man who would ultimately defeat Hannibal. But that was far in the future. For now, the elder Scipio retreated, his army bloodied and demoralised. The Romans, realising the severity of the threat, assembled a much larger force. They combined the army of Scipio with that of another consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, creating a force of over 40,000 men, including a large contingent of Roman legionaries and allied troops. Sempronius was eager for battle. He was a politician as much as a general, and he knew that a victory over Hannibal would make his career. Hannibal, aware of Sempronius's eagerness and his lack of caution, devised a trap. In December of 218 BCE, near the Trebia River, Hannibal deployed his army. He placed his infantry in the centre and his cavalry on the wings, a standard formation. But he also concealed a force of 2,000 men, infantry and cavalry mixed, in a ravine behind the Roman position, hidden by brush and the rolling terrain. Then he sent his Numidian cavalry to provoke the Romans, attacking their outposts and then retreating. Sempronius, as Hannibal had hoped, took the bait. He ordered his entire army to pursue, convinced that he could catch and destroy Hannibal's cavalry. The Roman troops, roused from their beds before dawn, had not eaten breakfast. They forded the icy Trebia River, waist-deep in the freezing water, and formed up on the far bank cold, wet, and hungry. Hannibal's army, by contrast, had eaten a hot meal and was rested. The battle began. The two infantry lines clashed in the centre, and for a time the Romans held their own. But Hannibal's cavalry, superior in both numbers and quality, swept aside the Roman horsemen and attacked the flanks of the Roman infantry. And then the hidden force in the ravine emerged, attacking the Romans from behind. The Roman army was surrounded. Most of the Romans fought desperately and died where they stood, but thousands were killed, captured or drowned trying to escape back across the Trebia. Only about 10,000 Romans, the core of the legionaries, managed to cut their way through the Carthaginian lines and escape. It was a devastating defeat, and it sent shockwaves through Rome. Hannibal had been in Italy for only a few months, and he had already destroyed a consular army. The Romans, stunned but not broken, regrouped. They elected new consuls and raised new armies. In the spring of 217 BCE, a Roman army under the consul Gaius Flaminius moved to intercept Hannibal as he marched south through central Italy. Flaminius was a popular general, a champion of the common people, but he was also impetuous and overconfident. Hannibal, observing Flaminius's movements, realised that the Roman general was pursuing him without adequate scouting or caution. Hannibal decided to set another trap. He chose a location on the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, in the region of Etruria. The road here ran along the lakeshore, with hills rising steeply on the inland side. Hannibal positioned his army in the hills, concealed by morning mist and the terrain. His heavy infantry and cavalry blocked the far end of the road, while his light troops and Gauls were hidden in the hills above the road itself. It was an ambush on a massive scale. Flaminius, eager to catch up with Hannibal, marched his army along the lakeshore road early in the morning. The mist was thick, and visibility was poor. The Romans, in marching column, walked straight into Hannibal's trap. The Carthaginians attacked from all sides at once. The Romans, caught completely by surprise, unable to form a proper battle line, were slaughtered. Flaminius himself was killed in the fighting, cut down by a Gallic warrior who recognised him by his armour. For 3 hours the Romans fought desperately, but there was no escape. They were pinned against the lake, attacked from the front, the sides, and behind. Some tried to swim across the lake and drowned, dragged down by the weight of their armour. When the battle ended, 15,000 Romans lay dead, including Flaminius. Another 15,000 were captured. It was one of the greatest ambushes in military history, and it demonstrated Hannibal's absolute mastery of terrain and tactics. In 2 major battles, Hannibal had destroyed 2 Roman armies. Rome itself was in a state of near panic. The Roman response to the crisis was to appoint a dictator, a single leader with absolute power, a constitutional mechanism reserved for emergencies. The man chosen was Quintus Fabius Maximus, an elder statesman, cautious and deliberate, the opposite of the impulsive generals who had led Rome to disaster. Fabius understood that Rome could not defeat Hannibal in open battle. Hannibal was simply too good a tactician, and his army, though smaller than Rome's, was composed of veteran professional, soldiers who were superior in quality to the hastily raised Roman legions. Fabius decided on a strategy of attrition. He would shadow Hannibal's army, staying in the hills, avoiding battle, cutting off foraging parties, harassing the Carthaginians, and denying them supplies. The goal was to wear down Hannibal's army over time, to starve them, to prevent them from recruiting new allies, and to wait for the moment when Hannibal made a mistake. It was a sensible strategy, and it was probably the only strategy that could have worked. But it was also deeply unpopular. The Romans called Fabius the delayer, cunctator, a term that was not meant as a compliment. The Roman public wanted action, wanted revenge for the defeats at Trebia and Trasimene. They saw Fabius's caution as cowardice, and when Fabius's term as dictator ended, the Romans elected new consuls who promised to take the fight to Hannibal. In 216 BCE, the Romans assembled the largest army they had ever fielded, over 80,000 infantry and several thousand cavalry, a force so large that it had to be commanded by both consuls jointly, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. The army marched south, into the region of Apulia, searching for Hannibal. They found him near the town of Cannae, on the plains of southeastern Italy, and there Hannibal would fight the battle that would define his legend and bring Rome to the edge of annihilation. The Battle of Cannae, fought on August 2nd, 216 BCE, is studied even today in military academies around the world as the perfect example of a double envelopment, the complete destruction of a numerically superior enemy force through superior tactics. Hannibal's army numbered perhaps 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. The Romans had 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. The Romans should have won. But Hannibal understood the psychology of his enemy. He knew that the Romans, with their massive infantry advantage, would try to overwhelm him with a direct frontal assault. And he decided to use that against them. Hannibal deployed his army in an unusual formation. He placed his weakest infantry, the Gauls and Iberians, in the centre, in a convex formation that bulged toward the enemy. On either side of this centre, he placed his African heavy infantry, his best troops, in two deep columns. His cavalry, superior to the Roman horsemen, was split between the two wings. The Romans deployed in their traditional formation, a dense mass of infantry in the centre, with cavalry on the wings. The Roman plan was simple: smash through the Carthaginian centre with overwhelming force and destroy Hannibal's army. The battle began with a cavalry engagement on the Roman right wing. Hannibal's heavy cavalry, led by his brother Hasdrubal, smashed into the Roman horsemen and drove them from the field. On the other wing, the Numidian light cavalry kept the Roman allied cavalry engaged, preventing them from intervening in the centre, and in the centre, the Roman infantry advanced. They slammed into the Carthaginian line, and the Gauls and Iberians, as Hannibal had intended, began to give ground. The Carthaginian centre bent backward, from a convex to a concave shape, but it did not break. The Romans, sensing victory, pushed harder, compressing their own lines as they pressed forward. And as the Carthaginian centre retreated, the African infantry on the flanks, previously parallel to the Roman line, began to angle inward, closing on the Roman flanks. The Roman army, focused entirely on the fight in the centre, did not notice. By the time they realised what was happening, it was too late. The African infantry attacked the Roman flanks, rolling up the Roman line from both sides. And then, Hasdrubal's cavalry, having defeated the Roman horsemen on the right, rode around the back of the battlefield and attacked the Roman cavalry on the left, driving them off as well. The Roman army was now surrounded, completely enclosed by Carthaginian forces on all sides. The Romans were packed so tightly together that they could barely move or wield their weapons. The Carthaginians pressed inward, stabbing, slashing, crushing the Romans in an ever-tightening circle. For hours the slaughter continued. The Roman soldiers, many of them young men in their first battle, fought with desperate courage, but there was no escape. By the time the sun set, 50,000 Romans lay dead on the field of Cannae, including the consul Paulus and dozens of senators and officers. Another 10,000 were captured. It was the worst military defeat in Roman history, a catastrophe of such magnitude that it seemed as though Rome itself might fall. Hannibal had destroyed not just an army, but the core of Rome's military leadership and the flower of its youth. Rome had lost in a single day what would take a generation to replace. The news of Cannae spread across Italy like wildfire, and the Roman alliance system, the network of treaties and subjugated peoples that provided Rome with its manpower, began to fracture. Several of the major Italian tribes and cities, seeing Rome's weakness, defected to Hannibal. Most significantly, Capua, the second largest city in Italy, opened its gates to Hannibal and declared for Carthage. In Sicily, Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city on the island, revolted against Roman rule. In the north, the Gallic tribes redoubled their support for Hannibal, and in the east, Philip V of Macedon, one of the most powerful kings in the Greek world, signed a treaty of alliance with Hannibal, promising to send troops to Italy and to attack Roman holdings in the Adriatic. Hannibal had achieved what he set out to do. He had shattered Rome's armies and broken Rome's alliances. Rome was isolated, its prestige destroyed, its manpower depleted, and yet Rome did not surrender. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire conflict. Any other state, having suffered the defeats that Rome had suffered, would have sued for peace. But Rome was different. The Romans possessed a resilience, a grim determination that defied all logic and all expectation. The Roman Senate met in emergency session. They refused to ransom the prisoners taken at Cannae, declaring that any Roman who had allowed himself to be captured had brought dishonour on himself and the Republic. They raised new legions from boys as young as 17, and from older men who had long since retired from military service. They armed slaves, promising them freedom if they fought. They emptied the treasury to pay for new equipment, and they prepared to fight on. The decision was made. Rome would not negotiate with Hannibal. Rome would not accept peace on Carthaginian terms. Rome would fight until either Rome or Carthage was destroyed. It was an existential struggle now, a war to the death. But Hannibal faced a problem. He had won the battles, but he could not win the war. He had defeated the Roman armies, but he could not take the city of Rome itself. Rome was heavily fortified, protected by massive walls that had been built centuries earlier after the Gallic sack of the city. Hannibal did not have the equipment or the manpower to conduct a siege of such a well-defended city. And even if he could besiege Rome, he would have to contend with the fact that Rome's Italian allies, despite some defections, had largely remained loyal. Rome could still raise armies, still call on reserves of manpower that Hannibal, leading a foreign army in hostile territory, could not match. Hannibal's strategy had always relied on the assumption that a series of crushing victories would cause the Roman alliance to collapse, that Rome's subjects would rise up and join Carthage, and while some had defected, most had not. The Romans had spent centuries building their alliance system, binding the Italian peoples to Rome through a combination of rewards, shared governance, and the threat of punishment. Those ties, it turned out, were stronger than Hannibal had anticipated, and so Hannibal found himself in a strange position. He controlled much of southern Italy. His army was intact and undefeated, but he could not force Rome to surrender. The war entered a new phase, a long and grinding stalemate. Hannibal moved his army from city to city, winning battles, recruiting allies, and trying to maintain pressure on Rome. But he could not strike the decisive blow, and Rome slowly and painfully began to adapt. The Romans, under the leadership of the surviving members of the Senate, implemented a strategy that was essentially a refined version of what Fabius Maximus had advocated. They would not face Hannibal in open battle. Instead, they would contain him, prevent him from recruiting more allies, and chip away at his forces through attrition. Rome raised multiple armies, smaller than the great host that had been destroyed at Cannae, but numerous and mobile. These armies shadowed Hannibal, cut off his supply lines, recaptured cities that had defected, and forced Hannibal to constantly move, preventing him from consolidating his gains, and Rome took the war to Hannibal's allies. The Romans besieged Capua, the city that had betrayed them, and after a long and brutal siege recaptured it in 211 BCE. The Roman revenge was savage. The leading citizens of Capua were executed, the population was enslaved or dispersed, and the city was reduced to a shadow of its former self. It was a message to any other city considering defection. Rome would not forgive. Rome would not forget. In Sicily, the Romans besieged and captured Syracuse, despite the ingenious defensive machines designed by the great mathematician and engineer Archimedes. Archimedes himself was killed during the sack of the city, reportedly by a Roman soldier who did not realize who he was. The Romans also sent armies to Spain, Hannibal's base of power, to attack the Carthaginian holdings there and cut off the reinforcements and supplies that Hannibal desperately needed. The war in Spain would continue for over a decade, a brutal and exhausting conflict fought in the mountains and valleys of the Iberian Peninsula. Hannibal, meanwhile, remained in southern Italy, a constant threat but unable to achieve the final victory. In 212 BCE, Hannibal attempted a bold stroke. He marched his army to the very gates of Rome itself, hoping that the sight of his army outside the walls would either terrify the Romans into surrender or cause a panic that he could exploit. The Romans, looking out from their walls at the Carthaginian camp, must have felt a deep sense of dread. But they did not panic. They did not surrender. The Roman Senate, in a gesture of supreme confidence, or perhaps supreme defiance, auctioned off the land on which Hannibal's army was camped, and the land sold for its usual price, as if there were no enemy army occupying it. Hannibal, unable to break through the walls and unwilling to waste his army in a futile siege, withdrew. He had come within sight of Rome, but he could not take it. The moment, often called Hannibal ad portus, Hannibal at the gates, became a symbol in Roman culture of existential danger narrowly averted. But it was also, in a sense, the high watermark of Hannibal's campaign. He would never come so close to Rome again. The years dragged on. Hannibal remained in Italy, fighting, manoeuvring, holding the southern regions, but unable to expand his influence. His allies, seeing that Hannibal could not deliver the final victory, began to waver. Some cities sued for peace with Rome, others were recaptured by force. Hannibal requested reinforcements from Carthage, but the Carthaginian government, focused on the war in Spain and dealing with internal politics and financial constraints, sent little help. Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal Barca, attempted to march another army from Spain to Italy to reinforce Hannibal, following the same route over the Alps. In 207 BCE, Hasdrubal successfully crossed the Alps with an army of around 30,000 men. If he could link up with Hannibal, the combined Carthaginian force might be strong enough to finally break Rome. But the Romans intercepted Hasdrubal in northern Italy, at the Metaurus River. In a hard-fought battle, the Romans destroyed Hasdrubal's army. Hasdrubal himself was killed fighting. The Romans took his severed head and threw it into Hannibal's camp. When Hannibal saw his brother's head, he reportedly said, "I see there the fate of Carthage." It was a moment of profound despair. Hannibal had been in Italy for over a decade, fighting an enemy that refused to quit, waiting for reinforcements that would never come. And now, his brother, the man who might have turned the tide, was dead. The war was slipping away from him. In Spain, meanwhile, the Romans had found a general who could match the Barcid family in skill and audacity. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son of the consul who had been wounded at Ticinus, had been given command of the Roman forces in Spain in 210 BCE. He was young, only in his mid-20s, but he had learned from observing Hannibal. Scipio understood that to defeat Carthage, Rome needed to do more than simply survive. Rome needed to take the offensive. Scipio launched a daring attack on New Carthage, the capital of Carthaginian Spain, and captured it in a single day through a combination of brilliant planning and sheer aggression. The fall of New Carthage was a devastating blow to Carthaginian power in Spain. It deprived Carthage of its main base, its treasury, and its stockpiles of weapons and supplies. Over the next few years, Scipio systematically defeated the Carthaginian armies in Spain, winning battle after battle, dismantling the empire that Hamilcar and Hasdrubal and Hannibal had built. By 206 BCE, Carthage had been driven out of Spain entirely. The silver mines, the recruitment grounds, the wealth that had sustained the war effort, all of it was lost, and Scipio was not finished. He returned to Rome as a hero and was elected consul. He proposed a bold plan. Rather than continue to fight Hannibal in Italy, he would take the war to Africa. He would invade Carthaginian territory, threaten the city of Carthage itself, and forced the Carthaginians to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend their homeland. It was a reversal of Hannibal's own strategy, and it was exactly what Rome needed. In 204 BCE, Scipio landed in North Africa with an army of around 30,000 men. The Carthaginians, caught off guard, scrambled to assemble a defence. They called on their ally Syphax, the king of the Numidian tribe of the Massassili, who provided cavalry and troops. But Scipio moved quickly. He negotiated an alliance with Massinissa, the king of another Numidian tribe, the Massili, who had been an enemy of Rome but who had been betrayed by Carthage and Syphax. Massinissa brought his cavalry to Scipio's side, evening the odds. In a night attack on the allied camps of the Carthaginians and Syphax, Scipio's forces set fire to the camps and slaughtered the defenders as they fled. It was a disaster for Carthage. Syphax's army was destroyed, and Syphax himself was later captured. The Carthaginian field army was shattered, and now Scipio was free to march on the city of Carthage itself. The Carthaginian government, facing the prospect of a Roman siege and the potential destruction of the city, panicked. They sued for peace, and they ordered Hannibal to return from Italy. Hannibal received the order in 203 BCE. For 15 years he had fought in Italy, undefeated in the field, his tactical genius unmatched, his army loyal to the end. He had marched from Spain, crossed the Alps, shattered Roman armies and brought Rome to its knees, and now he was being ordered to abandon the campaign, to leave Italy, and to return to Africa to defend Carthage. It must have been a bitter moment. Hannibal knew that leaving Italy meant admitting that his strategy had failed. He had not been able to force Rome to surrender. He had not been able to break the Roman will. And now the war had turned. Rome was on the offensive. Hannibal gathered his army, the veterans who had followed him through every trial, and embarked on ships bound for Africa. He left behind a land scarred by 15 years of war, a land where tens of thousands had died, and where his name would be remembered with a mixture of fear and respect for centuries to come. When Hannibal landed in Africa, he found Carthage in chaos. The peace negotiations with Scipio had broken down. The Carthaginian government, desperate and foolish, had violated the truce, seizing a Roman supply fleet that had been driven ashore by a storm. Scipio, furious, broke off negotiations and prepared for battle. The final confrontation between Rome and Carthage, between Scipio and Hannibal, was at hand. The two armies met in 202 BCE at a place called Zama, about 5 days' march southwest of Carthage. It was a confrontation that had been building for nearly 2 decades, a meeting between two of the greatest generals of the ancient world. Hannibal commanded an army of around 45,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry, including a large number of hastily recruited and poorly trained Carthaginian citizens, supplemented by veterans from Italy and a corps of war elephants. Scipio's army was slightly smaller in infantry, perhaps 35,000 men, but he had a significant advantage in cavalry, around 6,000 horsemen provided primarily by Massinissa's Numidians. The cavalry advantage would prove decisive. The battle began with Hannibal sending his elephants forward to break the Roman lines. But Scipio had prepared for this. He had trained his troops to open gaps in their formation, allowing the elephants to pass harmlessly through, and his skirmishers harassed the beasts with javelins and trumpets, panicking them. Many of the elephants turned and stampeded back into the Carthaginian lines, causing chaos. The elephant charge, which Hannibal had hoped would disrupt the Roman formation, had failed. The infantry lines then engaged. Hannibal had arranged his infantry in 3 lines, with his least reliable troops in the front, his Libyan veterans in the middle, and his Italian veterans in the rear. He hoped to wear down the Romans with the first 2 lines, then deliver the killing blow with his best troops. The fighting was brutal and prolonged. The first Carthaginian line was pushed back, and the second engaged. But the Roman legionaries, disciplined and well led, held firm. Meanwhile, on the flanks, the cavalry battle had been decided quickly. Massinissa's Numidians and the Roman cavalry had routed the Carthaginian horsemen, who were outnumbered and outmatched. The Carthaginian cavalry fled, and the Roman and Numidian horsemen pursued them off the battlefield. It seemed for a moment that they had abandoned Scipio. But Scipio had planned for this. He knew the cavalry would return, and return they did. As the infantry battle raged in the centre, with Hannibal's Italian veterans finally entering the fight and pushing the Romans back, the Roman and Numidian cavalry reappeared, riding around the back of the battlefield. They slammed into the rear of Hannibal's army, just as Hannibal had done to the Romans at Cannae. The Carthaginian army was surrounded. It was Cannae in reverse. The Carthaginians fought desperately, but they were overwhelmed. Thousands were killed, thousands more were captured. Hannibal, seeing that the battle was lost, fled the field with a small band of survivors. It was the first and only time Hannibal had been decisively defeated in battle, and it marked the end of the Second Punic War. The Carthaginians, with no army left and no hope of victory, sued for peace once more. This time the terms were even harsher than those that had ended the First Punic War. Carthage was forced to surrender all of its territories outside of Africa. The Carthaginian fleet, the instrument of Carthaginian power for centuries, was to be reduced to a mere 10 ships. Carthage was forbidden from waging war without Roman permission, and Carthage was required to pay a massive indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver to be paid over 50 years. It was a peace designed to cripple Carthage permanently, to reduce it from a great power to a Roman client state. Hannibal, the great general, returned to Carthage not as a conquering hero, but as the man who had led his people through a catastrophic defeat. Yet remarkably, he was not blamed. The Carthaginians recognized that Hannibal had done everything humanly possible to win the war, and that the failure was not his alone, but that of the Carthaginian state, which had not supported him adequately. In fact, Hannibal was elected as one of the Sufis, the chief magistrates of Carthage, in 196 BCE. As Suffete, Hannibal turned his energies to rebuilding his city. He implemented a series of reforms aimed at reducing corruption, improving the efficiency of the government, and reorganizing the tax system to ensure that the war indemnity to Rome could be paid without crippling the economy. Hannibal proved to be as skilled an administrator as he had been a general. Under his leadership, Carthage began to recover economically, its trade reviving, its treasury slowly refilling. But Hannibal's political reforms threatened the entrenched interests of the Carthaginian aristocracy, the wealthy families who had long dominated the Senate, and who benefited from the corrupt system. These aristocrats, seeing their power and wealth threatened, looked for a way to remove Hannibal. They found their opportunity by appealing to Rome. They sent envoys to the Roman Senate, claiming that Hannibal was plotting to renew the war against Rome, that he was in communication with Antiochus III, the king of the Seleucid Empire, one of the major Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged from the conquests of Alexander the Great. Antiochus was, at that time, in conflict with Rome over control of Greece and Asia Minor. The accusations against Hannibal were almost certainly false, or at least exaggerated, but they served their purpose. The Romans, ever suspicious of Hannibal, sent envoys to Carthage to demand that Hannibal be handed over to Roman custody. Hannibal, learning of the Roman demand, realized that he had no choice but to flee. In 195 BCE, he left Carthage in secret, sailing east. He would never see his homeland again. Hannibal spent the remaining years of his life in exile, moving from court to court, offering his services as a military advisor to the enemies of Rome. He went first to the court of Antiochus III in Syria. Antiochus welcomed Hannibal, recognizing the value of having the most famous general in the world on his side. Hannibal advised Antiochus in his war against Rome, but Antiochus did not fully trust Hannibal or give him a significant command, fearing perhaps that Hannibal's presence would provoke Rome even further. In 190 BCE, Antiochus was defeated by the Romans at the Battle of Magnesia, a catastrophic defeat that ended Seleucid power in the region. As part of the peace settlement, the Romans demanded that Antiochus hand over Hannibal. Once again, Hannibal fled. He travelled to the kingdom of Armenia, then to the island of Crete, and finally to Bithynia, a small kingdom in northwestern Asia Minor, where he entered the service of King Prusias III. Hannibal served as an admiral, helping Prusias in his conflicts with the neighbouring kingdom of Pergamum, a Roman ally. But Rome's reach was long, and Rome did not forget. In 183 BCE, the Romans sent an envoy to Prusias, demanding that he surrender Hannibal. Prusias, unwilling to defy Rome and risk war, agreed. Roman soldiers surrounded the villa where Hannibal was staying. Hannibal, now an old man in his 60s, realising that there was no escape this time, took poison. According to legend, his last words were, "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." It was a bitter, defiant end for the man who had brought Rome closer to destruction than anyone before or since. Hannibal Barca was dead, but his legacy lived on. In Rome, he became a figure of almost mythic status, the great enemy, the Carthaginian bogeyman invoked to frighten children and to warn politicians of the dangers of complacency. Roman generals studied his tactics, seeking to understand his genius and to apply his lessons to their own campaigns. Roman writers and historians, even while condemning him as a treacherous enemy, could not help but admire his skill, his determination, and his refusal to ever give up. And in the wider world, Hannibal became a symbol of defiance against overwhelming odds, a man who dared to challenge the mightiest empire of his age, and who came heartbreakingly close to victory. His crossing of the Alps would be remembered as one of the great feats of military history, a testament to the power of will and imagination. But what of Carthage itself? The city had survived the Second Punic War, but it was a shadow of what it had been. Its empire was gone, its navy was gone, its wealth was drained by the indemnity to Rome, and its autonomy was severely limited by Roman oversight. Yet, in the decades following the war, Carthage once again began to prosper. Trade resumed. The fields of the African hinterland produced abundant harvests. The population grew. Carthage, it seemed, was recovering. And in Rome, this recovery was watched with increasing alarm. There was a Roman senator named Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder or Cato the Censor. Cato had fought in the Second Punic War as a young man, and he had never forgotten the terror of Hannibal's invasion. Cato believed that as long as Carthage existed, Rome would never be safe. He believed that Carthage, given time, would rebuild its power and threaten Rome once more, and so Cato began a campaign to convince the Roman Senate that Carthage must be destroyed. According to tradition, Cato ended every speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of the topic, with the phrase "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. He once brought fresh figs to the Senate, claiming they had been picked in Carthage just 3 days earlier, to demonstrate how close and how prosperous Carthage was. It was a propaganda campaign, but it was effective. Gradually, opinion in Rome shifted. The Romans began to look for an excuse to finish what they had started. The excuse came in the form of a border dispute. Carthage's neighbour in North Africa was the Kingdom of Numidia, ruled by Massinissa, the same Massinissa who had allied with Scipio and fought at Zama. Massinissa had been richly rewarded by Rome for his loyalty, and he had spent the decades since the war expanding his kingdom at Carthage's expense. Massinissa would encroach on Carthaginian territory, seizing land and provoking skirmishes. Carthage, under the terms of its treaty, with Rome, was not allowed to wage war without Roman permission, so the Carthaginians appealed to Rome to arbitrate the disputes. The Romans, siding with their ally Massinissa, consistently ruled in his favour. The Carthaginians became increasingly frustrated. Finally, in 151 BCE, after decades of provocations, a faction within Carthage decided they had had enough. They raised an army and attacked Massinissa's forces in direct violation of the treaty with Rome. The Roman Senate had the pretext it needed. Rome declared war on Carthage. The Third Punic War had begun. But this war would be different from the first two. There would be no brilliant Carthaginian general leading armies across continents. There would be no epic battles on the plains of Italy or the fields of Spain. The Third Punic War was not a war of equals. It was an extermination. The Romans sent an army to North Africa, and they laid siege to the city of Carthage. The Carthaginians, realizing the magnitude of the threat, offered to surrender. They sent envoys to the Roman camp, offering to comply with any demand. The Romans replied with a series of ultimatums. First, Carthage must hand over 300 hostages, the children of the leading families. The Carthaginians complied. Then Carthage must surrender all of its weapons and armour. The Carthaginians, desperate to avoid war, complied again, handing over thousands of swords, spears, shields, and suits of armour, along with hundreds of catapults and other siege weapons. And then, when Carthage was defenceless, the Romans delivered the final demand. The city of Carthage was to be abandoned and destroyed. The Carthaginians could continue to exist as a people, but they would have to relocate to a new site, at least 10 miles inland from the sea. They would have to abandon the city that had been their home for over 600 years, the city that was the centre of their identity and their culture. They would have to give up the harbours, the temples, the markets, the homes, the tombs of their ancestors. Everything that made Carthage Carthage would be destroyed. The Carthaginian response was a mixture of despair and defiant rage. They refused. If Rome intended to destroy Carthage, then Carthage would fight. The city, which had just surrendered all of its weapons, began a desperate effort to rearm. Blacksmiths worked day and night, melting down statues and tools to make new weapons. Women cut their hair to provide strings for catapults. Slaves were freed and armed. The walls were repaired and strengthened. The Carthaginians elected 2 suffets to lead the defence, and they prepared to resist to the last. The Roman army, under the command of the consuls, began the siege of Carthage in 149 BCE. The Romans expected a quick victory. After all, Carthage had no army, no fleet, and no allies. But the Carthaginians fought with a desperation born of the knowledge that they were fighting not just for their freedom, but for their very existence. The siege dragged on for 3 years. The Romans, despite their overwhelming superiority in numbers and equipment, could not break through the Carthaginian defences. The walls of Carthage were massive, over 30 feet high and 30 feet thick in places, built of stone and reinforced with towers. The city was supplied by sea, and the Romans, despite their efforts, could not fully blockade the harbours. Inside the city, the Carthaginians endured starvation, disease, and constant bombardment, but they did not surrender. In 147 BCE, the Romans appointed a new commander, Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, the man who had defeated Hannibal at Zama. The younger Scipio was a skilled general and an implacable enemy of Carthage. He tightened the siege, building a massive mole across the harbour mouth to cut off the city's access to the sea. He systematically assaulted the Carthaginian positions, forcing the defenders back inch by inch. By the spring of 146 BCE, the outer defences of Carthage had fallen. Scipio's troops breached the walls and poured into the city. What followed was a nightmare of urban warfare. The Carthaginians, with nowhere left to retreat, fought from house to house, street to street, rooftop to rooftop. The fighting was savage and merciless. The Romans set fire to buildings, burning the defenders alive. They threw the bodies of the dead into the streets until the streets were choked with corpses. The Roman soldiers, driven by fury and the promise of plunder, showed no mercy to combatants or civilians. Women and children were killed or enslaved. The city burned. For 6 days and 6 nights the battle raged through the streets of Carthage. By the end, 50,000 Carthaginians, the survivors of the siege, emerged from the ruins and surrendered. They were sold into slavery. The city itself was systematically demolished. The Romans tore down the buildings, stone by stone, filling in the harbours, destroying the aqueducts, smashing the monuments and temples. According to legend, the Romans ploughed the ruins and sowed them with salt, so that nothing would ever grow there again. The salt story is likely a later invention, a dramatic embellishment, but it captures the totality of the destruction. Carthage, the great rival of Rome, the city that had ruled the Western Mediterranean for centuries, was erased from the map. The site was declared cursed, and it was forbidden for anyone to live there. Carthage was no more. But the story of Carthage does not end with its destruction. The legacy of Carthage lived on, in unexpected ways. The Romans, even as they destroyed the city, could not erase the influence that Carthage had exerted on the ancient world. Carthaginian technology, particularly in navigation and agriculture, was absorbed by Rome. The Romans studied Carthaginian farming manuals, learning techniques for cultivating olive trees and vineyards that would become the basis of the Roman agricultural economy. The Punic language, though it declined, continued to be spoken in parts of North Africa for centuries after the fall of Carthage, influencing the languages that came after. And the memory of Carthage, the memory of a great civilization that had dared to challenge Rome and had nearly won, became a permanent part of the Roman psyche. For centuries, Roman mothers would warn their children to behave, or Hannibal will come for you. Roman politicians would invoke the Punic Wars as examples of the need for vigilance and strength. And Roman historians would write about Carthage with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect, preserving its story for future generations. The site of Carthage itself was eventually rebuilt, over a century later, as a Roman city. Julius Caesar proposed the idea, and it was carried out under the Emperor Augustus. The new city, Colonia Julia Carthago, became one of the most important cities in the Roman Empire, the capital of the province of Africa, a centre of trade, learning and Christianity. In the Christian era, Carthage produced some of the most important theologians and thinkers, including Tertullian and Augustine of Hippo, whose works would shape the development of Christian theology for centuries. But this new Carthage was a Roman city, built on Roman principles, with Roman law and Roman culture. The Punic Carthage, the Carthage of Dido, and Hamilcar and Hannibal, was gone. Its people were scattered or assimilated. Its language faded into silence. Its gods were forgotten, their temples replaced by Roman basilicas and Christian churches. The Carthaginians became a people without a country, their identity absorbed into the broader tapestry of the Roman world. And yet, we remember them. We remember them because their story is, in the end, a profoundly human one. It is a story of ambition and resilience, of great achievements and terrible failures. It is a story of a people who built an empire on trade and ingenuity, who sailed to the ends of the known world, who created art and architecture and literature that rivaled the Greeks and the Egyptians. It is a story of generals who defied the impossible, of soldiers who followed those generals through mountains and deserts and years of war. It is a story of a civilization that fought for its survival against a relentless enemy, and that in the end was destroyed not because it was weak, but because it faced an opponent that would accept nothing less than total annihilation. The story of Carthage is a reminder that history is not always written by the just or the righteous. It is written by the victors, and the victors in this case were the Romans, who not only defeated Carthage, but also controlled how Carthage would be remembered. Nearly everything we know about Carthage comes from Roman sources or from Greek sources that were sympathetic to Rome. The Carthaginians themselves left few written records, and most of those that existed were destroyed when the city was burned. We have no Carthaginian histories, no Carthaginian epics, no Carthaginian perspective on the wars that defined their civilization. We see Carthage through the eyes of its enemies, and we must always remember that those eyes were not neutral. This poses a challenge for historians. How do we reconstruct the story of a civilization that left so little behind in its own voice? How do we separate propaganda from truth when the primary sources are written by the people who destroyed them? We turn to archaeology. We examine the ruins, the pottery, the coins, the inscriptions. We analyse the layout of cities, the construction of harbours, the design of ships. We study the Tophet, the sacred precinct where the remains of children were buried, and we debate what it means. Was it truly a place of child sacrifice, as the Roman sources claim, or was it a cemetery for infants who died of natural causes, their deaths ritualised and misinterpreted by hostile foreign observers? We may never know for certain. We piece together fragments, we compare accounts, we try to read between the lines of Roman propaganda to glimpse the truth beneath. And slowly, carefully, a picture emerges. Not a complete picture, never a complete picture, but enough to understand that Carthage was more than the monster Rome made it out to be. Carthage was a civilization, with all the complexity and contradiction that entails. The Carthaginians were merchants, yes, but they were also artists. The ruins of Carthaginian cities have yielded beautiful mosaics, intricate jewellery, carved ivories, and painted ceramics. The Carthaginians were sailors, yes, but they were also engineers, building harbours and aqueducts that rivaled Roman constructions. The Carthaginians were warriors, yes, but they were also diplomats, navigating the complex web of alliances and rivalries that define the ancient Mediterranean. They were not, in short, the barbaric, treacherous, child-sacrificing villains of Roman propaganda. They were people who loved and feared and hoped and struggled, just as the Romans did, and they were people who, in the end, lost. History, as we're often reminded, is written by the victors, but that does not mean we must accept the victor's version without question. We can and should interrogate the sources, challenge the narratives, and seek out the voices of those who are silenced. One of the great tragedies of Carthage's destruction is the loss of its literature and learning. We know from references in Greek and Roman texts that the Carthaginians had an extensive library, that they wrote books on agriculture, navigation, history, and religion. One of the most famous was a treatise on agriculture by a Carthaginian named Mago, a multi-volume work that was so highly regarded that the Romans, after the destruction of Carthage, ordered it to be translated into Latin. It became one of the foundational texts of Roman agricultural science. But the original Punic text is lost. We have only fragments, quoted or paraphrased by Roman writers. The same is true of Carthaginian history. There were Carthaginian historians, men who recorded the deeds of their generals and the rise and fall of their empire. But their works are gone, burned in the fires that consumed Carthage or lost in the centuries that followed. We know they existed only because later writers occasionally cite them. What stories did they tell? What perspective did they offer on the wars with Rome, on the reign of their kings and suffets, on the founding of their city? We will never know. The voices of Carthage have been silenced, and we are left with only echoes, distorted and incomplete. And yet, paradoxically, the destruction of Carthage ensured that it would never be forgotten. By making Carthage into the ultimate enemy, by framing the Punic Wars as an existential struggle, the Romans elevated Carthage to a central place in their own mythology. Carthage became the dark mirror of Rome, the rival that defined what Rome was by being what Rome was not. Where Rome was a republic of citizen soldiers, Carthage was a plutocracy of merchants and mercenaries. Where Rome emphasized duty and tradition, Carthage represented ambition and innovation. Where Rome claimed to be pious and honourable, Carthage was painted as impious and treacherous. These characterizations were, of course, simplistic and often unfair, but they served a purpose. They allowed Rome to define itself, to create a narrative of identity that would endure for centuries, and in doing so, Rome ensured that Carthage would be remembered, if not accurately, then at least vividly. The story of Hannibal in particular became a permanent fixture of Western culture. He was the great enemy, the man who nearly destroyed Rome, the genius who crossed the Alps and shattered Roman legions. His name became synonymous with military brilliance and with implacable enmity. Generations of military commanders, from the Roman generals who succeeded him to Napoleon Bonaparte to modern strategists, have studied Hannibal's campaigns and sought to emulate his tactics. The Battle of Cannae in particular became the gold standard of military victory, the perfect battle, studied in military academies around the world even today. But Hannibal was more than just a military commander. He was a symbol, a figure onto whom people could project their own ideas about heroism, tragedy, and the nature of conflict. In the centuries after his death, Hannibal was reimagined again and again by different cultures and different eras. To the Romans, he was the bogeyman, the eternal enemy. To later European writers, he was the tragic hero, the man of genius who was betrayed by fate and by his own government. To anti-imperialist thinkers, he was the champion of the oppressed, the leader of a small nation fighting against the imperial juggernaut. To military historians, he was the ultimate tactician, the master of manoeuvre and deception. Each age has found in Hannibal what it wanted to find, and in doing so, has kept his memory alive. But we must also remember that Hannibal was a human being, not a symbol. He was a man who grew up in a world of war, who was shaped by his father's ambitions and his nation's grievances, who spent his adult life in military camps and on battlefields. He was a man who commanded the loyalty of thousands, who made decisions that resulted in victory and in death, who experienced triumph and defeat, hope and despair. And he was a man who, in the end, was hunted across the Mediterranean, denied a home, and forced to take his own life to avoid capture. It is a story of immense tragedy, and it is worth remembering not just for its drama, but for its humanity. The same is true of Carthage as a whole. It is easy to see Carthage as simply the enemy of Rome, the antagonist in a grand historical drama. But Carthage was more than that. It was a city of hundreds of thousands of people, each with their own lives, their own stories. There were farmers who tilled the fields of the African hinterland, growing grain and olives and grapes. There were merchants who travelled to distant lands, negotiating deals and bringing back exotic goods. There were craftsmen who worked in bronze and iron, creating tools and weapons and works of art. There were priests and priestesses who tended the temples, performing rituals and making offerings to the gods. There were mothers and fathers raising children, teaching them the skills and values they would need to survive and thrive. There were poets and musicians, sailors and soldiers, slaves and aristocrats. All of them were part of Carthage, and all of them were caught up in the great conflicts that would ultimately destroy their city. We do not know their names. We do not know their stories. But they existed, and their lives mattered. And when we tell the story of Carthage, we must remember them, not just the generals and kings, but the ordinary people who made up the fabric of the civilization. The destruction of Carthage was not just a military or political event. It was a human catastrophe. Tens of thousands died in the siege. 50,000 were enslaved. An entire civilization was erased. The survivors were scattered, their identities subsumed into the Roman world. The language they spoke, the gods they worshipped, the traditions they honoured, all of it faded and disappeared. Within a few generations there were no more Carthaginians, only Africans who lived in a Roman province and who spoke Latin and who worshipped Roman gods. The cultural genocide of Carthage was thorough and complete. It is a sobering reminder of what conquest and empire building actually mean, beneath the rhetoric of glory and destiny. The Romans justified the destruction of Carthage by claiming it was necessary for their security, that Carthage posed an existential threat. But was this true? By the time of the Third Punic War, Carthage was a client state, disarmed and dependent on Rome. It posed no credible military threat. The decision to destroy Carthage was not born of necessity, but of fear and of a desire for vengeance, and perhaps of greed for the rich agricultural lands of the Carthaginian territory. The Romans wanted to eliminate a rival, to remove any possibility that Carthage might one day rise again, and they succeeded. But in doing so, they committed an act that even some Romans in later years recognised as morally troubling. The destruction of Carthage became, for some Roman writers, an example of Rome's capacity for ruthlessness, a dark counterpoint to the Republic's claimed virtues. So what can we learn from the story of Carthage? What lessons does it hold for us today? Perhaps the most obvious lesson is about the nature of power and the dynamics of conflict between great states. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage was, in many ways, inevitable. Both were ambitious, expansionist powers. Both wanted to control the resources and trade routes of the Mediterranean. Both saw the other as a threat, and both were willing to fight at enormous cost to achieve their goals. The Punic Wars were not caused by a single event or a single decision, but by a structural conflict, a clash of interests that could not be resolved peacefully. This pattern is familiar. Throughout history, rising powers and established powers have come into conflict, and those conflicts have often been resolved through war. The Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, the Napoleonic Wars between France and the other European powers, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The story of Carthage and Rome is an early example of this dynamic, and it shows us both the costs and the consequences of such conflicts. But the story of Carthage also teaches us about resilience and the limits of resilience. Carthage survived the First Punic War, recovered, rebuilt, and came back stronger. It survived the Mercenary War, which nearly tore it apart from within. It even survived the catastrophic defeat of the Second Punic War, paying its indemnities, rebuilding its economy, and beginning to prosper once more. Carthage demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to endure, to adapt, to survive disaster. But there were limits. When Rome decided that Carthage must be destroyed, when Rome committed itself not just to defeating Carthage but to erasing it, there was nothing Carthage could do. No amount of resilience, no amount of defiance could save it. The Third Punic War was not a war that Carthage could win. It was not even a war that Carthage could survive. It was an execution dressed up as a military campaign. This raises uncomfortable questions about power and about the nature of international relations. Is there a point at which a weaker power, no matter how resilient or resourceful, simply cannot prevail against a stronger one that is determined to destroy it? The story of Carthage suggests that there is. Another lesson is about the importance of alliances and the danger of isolation. Carthage's great weakness throughout the Punic Wars was its relative isolation. It had allies, certainly. It had client states and trading partners, but it did not have the kind of deep, enduring alliance system that Rome possessed. Rome's strength was not just its own legions, but the legions of its Italian allies, the cities and tribes that Rome had bound to itself through a combination of carrots and sticks, of shared citizenship and the threat of punishment. When Hannibal invaded Italy, he hoped to shatter this alliance system, to convince Rome's allies to defect. Some did, but most did not. They remained loyal to Rome, even when Rome was losing, even when Hannibal was at the gates. Why? Because Rome had given them a stake in the system. They were part of the Roman project. They benefited from Roman protection and Roman trade, and they feared what would happen if Rome fell. Carthage, by contrast, relied heavily on mercenaries, soldiers who fought for pay rather than loyalty. This gave Carthage flexibility, but it also meant that Carthage's army was only as reliable as its ability to pay. And when the money ran out, or when a rival offered better terms, the mercenaries could and did turn. The mercenary war was the most dramatic example, but the underlying problem was constant. Carthage did not inspire the kind of loyalty that Rome did. It did not create a community of interest. It was a commercial empire, a network of transactions, and transactions can always be renegotiated. This is not to say that Rome was somehow morally superior to Carthage. Rome could be brutal, ruthless, and treacherous. Rome destroyed cities, enslaved populations, and waged wars of conquest across 3 continents. Rome was an imperial power, and imperial powers, by their nature, commit violence and injustice. But Rome was effective. Rome built systems that endured. Rome created institutions that could survive the death of individual leaders and the loss of individual battles. Rome, in short, understood power in a way that Carthage perhaps did not. Carthage was a great trading city, a maritime empire built on commerce and wealth. But trade alone cannot sustain an empire when faced with a rival that is willing and able to wage total war. Carthage needed to be more than a network of trading posts. It needed to be a state, with a citizen army, with deep roots in its territory, with allies who would fight for it not just because they were paid, but because they believed in the cause. Hannibal understood this. His strategy of invading Italy was designed precisely to break Rome's alliance system, to show that Rome could be defeated, that its allies did not have to submit. But Hannibal could not create an alternative system to replace Rome. He could offer freedom from Roman rule, but he could not offer the stability and protection that Rome provided. And so, his strategy ultimately failed. The story of Carthage is also a story about the role of individuals in history. To what extent can a single person shape the course of events? Hannibal Barca was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary individuals in ancient history. His genius, his courage, his determination were all remarkable, and he came closer than anyone to defeating Rome. But in the end, he could not do it alone. He needed support from Carthage, reinforcements, supplies, money. And that support was never adequate. The Carthaginian government, divided by factionalism and distracted by other concerns, did not give Hannibal what he needed to win. Was this because the Carthaginians did not understand the stakes? Or was it because they could not afford to? Or was it because there were elements within Carthage who actively opposed Hannibal and his family, who saw the Barcids as a threat to their own power? We cannot know for certain, but the result was the same. Hannibal, for all his brilliance, could not overcome the structural weaknesses of the state he served. This is a recurring theme in history. Great individuals can achieve extraordinary things, but they are always constrained by the systems and institutions within which they operate. Hannibal was a military genius, but he was not a political miracle worker. He could not single-handedly transform Carthage into the kind of state that could defeat Rome. And so, despite his victories, despite his legend, he ultimately failed. Conversely, we might ask what role Rome's institutions played in its eventual victory. Rome, at the time of the Punic Wars, was a republic, governed by elected magistrates and a senate of former magistrates. Power was distributed, checked, balanced. No single individual could dominate the state for long. This system had weaknesses. It could be slow to make decisions. It could be paralysed by political infighting. But it also had strengths. It was resilient. When one consul was killed, another was elected. When one army was destroyed, another was raised. Rome had a depth of resources, both human and institutional, that allowed it to absorb losses that would have destroyed other states. After Cannae, after losing 50,000 men in a single day, Rome did not surrender. It did not negotiate. It kept fighting. This was not just stubbornness. It was a function of the Roman political system, which made it almost impossible for any individual or faction to unilaterally make peace. The Senate had to agree. The people had to agree. And as long as there was a will to fight, the institutions provided the means to do so. Carthage, by contrast, was also a republic, but its political system was different. Power was more concentrated in the hands of a wealthy elite. Decision-making was more centralized, and this made Carthage both more efficient in some ways and more vulnerable in others. When the Carthaginian elite decided to sue for peace, that decision could be implemented quickly. But it also meant that Carthage could be forced into peace, even when its armies were still in the field, even when there was still hope of victory. Hannibal was recalled from Italy not because his army had been defeated, but because the Carthaginian government decided that the war could not be won, and that peace, even humiliating peace, was preferable to continued fighting. There's also a geographical dimension to consider. Rome's position in the centre of the Italian peninsula gave it access to a vast reservoir of manpower. Italy, at the time of the Punic Wars, had a population of several million, and Rome could draw on much of that population for its armies. Carthage, by contrast, was based in North Africa, with a smaller citizen population and a hinterland that was less densely populated and less fully under Carthaginian control. Carthage had to rely more heavily on mercenaries and on troops drawn from its overseas possessions. This made Carthaginian armies more diverse, and in some ways more skilled, but also more difficult to sustain and less loyal. Geography also affected strategy. Rome could afford to fight a defensive war in Italy, using its interior lines of communication to shift forces and respond to threats. Hannibal, operating in hostile territory far from his base, had no such luxury. He had to keep moving, keep foraging, keep his army together through sheer force of will. And as the years dragged on, as his forces dwindled and Rome's grew, the geographical advantage became decisive. Hannibal could win battles, but he could not win the war, because he could not replace his losses, and Rome could. The story of Carthage also illuminates the role of economic power in ancient warfare. Carthage was, throughout its history, a wealthy city. It controlled lucrative trade routes. It exported goods across the Mediterranean. It mined silver in Spain. This wealth allowed Carthage to hire large armies, to build fleets, to finance wars. But wealth alone was not enough. Rome was poorer than Carthage, at least initially, but Rome had something that Carthage lacked: a sustainable economic base rooted in agriculture and in the productive capacity of its Italian allies. Rome could lose fleets, could see its fields burned, could suffer enormous casualties, and still recover, because the underlying economy was resilient and decentralized. Carthage's economy, by contrast, was more dependent on trade, which could be disrupted by blockades and by the loss of overseas territories. When Rome took Sicily, then Sardinia, then Spain, it cut off Carthage's sources of revenue. By the time of the Third Punic War, Carthage was economically weakened, unable to sustain a prolonged conflict. This pattern, too, is familiar in history. Economic strength is a necessary but not sufficient condition for military success. A state must be able to translate its wealth into military power, and it must be able to sustain that power over time. Carthage could do this in the short term, but not in the long term. Rome could. Another dimension of the Carthage story is cultural and religious. The Carthaginians worshipped gods that the Greeks and Romans found strange and disturbing. The practice of child sacrifice, if it occurred as described, was particularly shocking to classical audiences. The Greeks and Romans practiced animal sacrifice, and they occasionally practiced human sacrifice in times of extreme crisis, but it was not a regular or widespread practice. The Carthaginians, according to their enemies, sacrificed children as a matter of routine religious observance. This claim was used by Greek and Roman writers to portray the Carthaginians as barbaric, as fundamentally different from and inferior to the civilized peoples of the Mediterranean. But we must ask, how much of this was true and how much was propaganda? The archaeological evidence from the Tophet, the sacred precinct in Carthage where the remains of children were buried, is consistent with some form of ritual involving the burial of very young children, but it is not conclusive evidence of sacrifice. Some scholars argue that the Tophet was a cemetery for infants who died of natural causes, perhaps premature births, or children who died shortly after birth, and that the burial rites were misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented by hostile observers. Others argue that the evidence does suggest sacrifice, but that it was rare, reserved for times of extreme crisis, and that it was not the routine practice that Roman propaganda made it out to be. We will probably never know the full truth. What we can say is that the accusation of child sacrifice served a purpose for Rome and for Greece. It allowed them to frame the conflict with Carthage not as a political or economic rivalry, but as a moral one, a struggle between civilization and barbarism. This made it easier to justify the destruction of Carthage, to argue that such a people did not deserve to exist. It is a pattern that recurs throughout history. Dehumanize the enemy, portray them as monstrous, and then the most extreme actions against them can be rationalized. The Romans did this with Carthage, they did it later with other enemies, and countless other civilizations have done the same. The story of Carthage reminds us to be skeptical of such characterizations, to ask who is telling the story and why, and to remember that the people being demonized were, in fact, people, with their own cultures, their own beliefs, their own humanity. The religious practices of Carthage were not just a matter of propaganda. They were part of a broader cultural difference between Carthage and Rome. Carthage was a Phoenician city, part of a cultural tradition that stretched back to the ancient Near East, to Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Carthaginians spoke a Semitic language, related to Hebrew and Aramaic. Their gods, Baal-Hamon and Tanit, were versions of deities worshipped across the Levant. Their art and architecture drew on Near Eastern models, with influences from Egypt and Greece. Carthage was, in many ways, a bridge between the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean world, a fusion of traditions. Rome, by contrast, was a Latin city, part of the Indo-European cultural sphere. The Romans spoke an Indo-European language. Their gods, Jupiter and Mars and Venus, were part of a pantheon related to the Greek gods, and ultimately to the gods of the ancient Indo-Europeans. Roman culture was heavily influenced by the Greeks, and Rome saw itself as part of the Hellenic world, even as it conquered that world. This cultural difference mattered. It shaped how Carthage and Rome saw each other, and it shaped how later historians and writers interpreted the conflict. The Punic Wars were not just a political rivalry. They were, in some sense, a clash of civilizations, a conflict between different ways of organising society, different ways of understanding the world, different ways of relating to the divine. But we must be careful not to overstate this. Carthage and Rome were not as different as Roman propaganda made them out to be. Both were Mediterranean city-states. Both were republics, governed by elected magistrates and senates, not by kings. Both valued military prowess and commercial success. Both were pragmatic, willing to make alliances, to negotiate, to adapt. The differences between them were real, but so were the similarities, and the conflict between them was driven not by cultural incompatibility, but by political and economic rivalry. They were competing for the same resources, the same trade routes, the same strategic positions. One did not have to be destroyed for the other to prosper. but Rome came to believe that it did, and so Carthage was destroyed. The legacy of Carthage is complex and multifaceted. In the immediate aftermath of its destruction, Carthage was remembered primarily as Rome's great enemy, the rival that had nearly brought Rome to its knees. Roman writers returned to the story of the Punic Wars again and again, using it to illustrate moral lessons about courage and perseverance, about the dangers of complacency, about the importance of unity in the face of external threats. The story of Hannibal, in particular, became a staple of Roman education. Young Romans learned about his campaigns, studied his tactics, and were taught to see him as both a genius and a warning. Hannibal became, in Roman culture, the embodiment of the cunning, dangerous foreigner, the enemy who could not be trusted, who would stop at nothing to destroy Rome. But he was also, paradoxically, a figure of admiration. Roman generals modelled themselves on Hannibal, trying to emulate his boldness and his tactical brilliance. Hannibal was the enemy, but he was also the standard by which Roman generals measured themselves. In the centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the memory of Carthage faded somewhat in Europe. The medieval period was more focused on the legacy of Rome itself, on the church, on the barbarian, kingdoms that succeeded Rome. But the story of Carthage was preserved in the classical texts that medieval scholars studied, and it was never entirely forgotten. With the Renaissance, with the revival of interest in classical antiquity, Carthage came back into focus. Humanist scholars read Livy and Polybius and Virgil, and they rediscovered the story of the Punic Wars, and they began to interpret that story in new ways, not just as a tale of Roman triumph, but as a tragedy, a story of a great civilization destroyed. Hannibal, in particular, was rehabilitated in the Renaissance and early modern period. He was portrayed not as a villain, but as a hero, a man of genius who fought against overwhelming odds, who remained loyal to his cause even when that cause was doomed. He became a symbol of resistance, of the struggle of the individual against fate and against empire. This reinterpretation of Carthage and Hannibal continued into the modern era. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as European powers built their own empires and engaged in their own rivalries, the story of Carthage and Rome took on new resonance. Some writers saw in Carthage a parallel to their own nations or to nations they admired. Carthage, the commercial republic, was compared to the Netherlands or to Britain, maritime powers built on trade. Rome, the military republic turned empire, was compared to France under Napoleon, or to the rising powers of Germany and the United States. The Punic Wars became a lens through which to understand contemporary geopolitics, and Hannibal became a figure onto whom people could project their own political ideals. For some, he was the champion of liberty, fighting against Roman imperialism. For others, he was the tragic genius, the man who could have changed history if only circumstances had been different. For still others, he was a cautionary tale about the limits of individual brilliance, a reminder that even the greatest general cannot overcome structural disadvantages. In the 20th century, the story of Carthage took on yet another dimension with the rise of archaeology as a scientific discipline. For the first time, scholars could study Carthage directly, not through the hostile accounts of Roman historians, but through the physical remains of the city itself. Excavations at the site of Carthage, which by then was part of French colonial Tunisia, revealed the scale and sophistication of the Carthaginian civilization. Archaeologists uncovered the harbours, the fortifications, the residential districts, the temples, the Tophet. They found Punic inscriptions, pottery, jewellery, tools. They could reconstruct, at least partially, what life in Carthage had actually been like. And what they found challenged many of the assumptions that had come down from the Roman sources. Carthage was not a barbaric city. It was a cosmopolitan metropolis, a centre of trade and culture, a city with advanced engineering and a high standard of living. The Carthaginians were not the monsters of Roman propaganda. They were people with a rich and complex civilization. This archaeological work has continued into the 21st century, and it continues to reshape our understanding of Carthage. Modern scholars use a combination of archaeology, linguistic analysis, comparative studies, and critical reading of ancient texts to build a more nuanced picture of Carthaginian society. But there are still enormous gaps in our knowledge. The Carthaginians wrote books, but almost none survive. We have Punic inscriptions, but they are mostly short dedications or funerary texts, not narratives or literature. We have descriptions of Carthaginian practices from Greek and Roman writers, but we must always remember that these are the descriptions of outsiders, often hostile outsiders, and they may be inaccurate or biased. The true voice of Carthage, the Carthaginian perspective on their own history, is lost, and that is a tragedy. We will never know how the Carthaginians saw themselves, how they understood their place in the world, how they remembered their own past. We will never read Carthaginian epics or Carthaginian histories or Carthaginian philosophy. We will never hear Carthaginian music or see Carthaginian plays. All of that was destroyed, deliberately and systematically, when Rome burned Carthage to the ground. This loss is not just a loss for scholars or for historians, it is a loss for all of humanity. Every civilization that has existed has contributed something unique to the human story, some insight or innovation or perspective that enriches our collective understanding. When a civilization is destroyed, when its knowledge is burned and its people are scattered, that contribution is lost. We're all poorer for it. The destruction of Carthage was, in this sense, a crime not just against the Carthaginians, but against human civilization itself. It was an act of cultural erasure, an attempt to remove an entire people and their achievements from the record of history. The Romans tried to do this, and to a large extent they succeeded. But they did not succeed completely. The memory of Carthage has endured, however imperfectly, however distorted by the lens of Roman propaganda. And as long as we continue to tell the story of Carthage, as long as we continue to study its ruins and to ask questions about its people, the Carthaginians have not been entirely forgotten. The site of ancient Carthage today is a suburb of Tunis, the capital of Tunisia. It is a place where the past and present coexist in complex ways. The ruins of Punic Carthage are scattered and fragmentary, mostly foundations and walls, difficult for the non-specialist to interpret. More visible are the ruins of Roman Carthage, the city that was built on top of the Punic city in the 1st century BCE and that flourished for centuries as one of the great cities of the Roman Empire. There are Roman villas with beautiful mosaics, Roman baths that once rivaled those of Rome, itself, Roman theatres and amphitheatres, a Roman aqueduct that carried water from the mountains to the city. These ruins are impressive, and they speak to the grandeur of Roman Carthage, but they also serve as a reminder of what was lost. Beneath the Roman ruins, beneath centuries of rubble and earth, lie the remains of Punic Carthage, the city of Dido and Hannibal. Most of it is gone, destroyed so thoroughly that archaeologists struggle to reconstruct even the basic layout of the city. But fragments remain, and those fragments are precious because they are all we have. To walk through the ruins of Carthage today is to experience a kind of vertigo, a dizzying sense of the layers of history compressed into a single place. You can stand on the hill of Byrsa, the citadel of ancient Carthage, and look out over the Mediterranean, the same sea that Carthaginian ships once sailed. You can visit the remains of the Punic ports, now silted up and landlocked, but still recognisable in their circular shape. You can see sections of the Punic walls, massive constructions of stone that once protected the city. You can walk through the Tophet, the sacred precinct where the controversial burials of children took place, now a peaceful garden with rows of stone markers. And you can visit the museum, where artefacts from Carthage are displayed. Carved stone stele with Punic inscriptions, pottery painted with geometric designs, glass beads and amulets, bronze figurines of gods and worshippers, a stone sarcophagus carved with the figure of a priest. These objects are beautiful and haunting. They are the material traces of lives lived more than 2,000 years ago, of people who walked the same streets, looked out over the same sea, worshipped gods whose names are now almost forgotten. But even as we try to reconstruct Carthage from these fragments, we must acknowledge the limits of what we can know. Archaeology can tell us about material culture, about what people made and built and used. It can tell us about trade networks and economic systems. It can tell us sometimes about religious practices and social structures, but it cannot tell us what people thought or felt. It cannot tell us their stories, their dreams, their fears. For that, we need written sources, and the written sources for Carthage are overwhelmingly Roman. We see Carthage through Roman eyes, and we cannot escape that perspective. This is the fundamental challenge of studying Carthage, and it is a challenge that cannot be fully overcome. We can try to read critically, to identify bias, to look for evidence that contradicts the Roman narrative. But we will always be working with limited and compromised sources. The best we can do is to be honest about these limitations, to acknowledge what we do not know, and to resist the temptation to fill in the gaps with speculation, or with the uncritical acceptance of Roman propaganda. What, then, can we say with confidence about Carthage? We can say that it was one of the great civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean, a maritime empire that lasted for over 6 centuries. We can say that it was founded by Phoenician colonists from Tyre, probably in the late 9th or early 8th century BCE, and that it grew to become the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. We can say that Carthage was a commercial republic, governed by elected magistrates and a senate, and that it built its power on trade, on control of sea routes, and on the exploitation of resources from its colonies and territories. We can say that Carthage fought 3 major wars with Rome, the Punic Wars, and that these wars were among the largest and most destructive conflicts of the ancient world. We can say that Carthage produced at least one military commander of extraordinary genius, Hannibal Barca, who came closer than anyone to defeating Rome. And we can say that Carthage was ultimately destroyed by Rome in 146 BCE, its city razed, its people killed or enslaved, its culture systematically erased. Beyond these basic facts, much remains uncertain or debated. The exact nature of Carthaginian government, the details of its social structure, the content of its literature and philosophy, its religious practices, its art and music, all of these are known only imperfectly, if at all. We have glimpses, fragments, hints. But we do not have the full picture, and we never will. This is frustrating for historians, but it is also, in a way, appropriate. Carthage was destroyed, it was meant to be forgotten. The fact that we remember it at all, that we can piece together even this much of its story, is a testament to the power of human curiosity and the enduring nature of the past. The stones of Carthage may have been torn down, the people may have been scattered, the books may have been burned, but the past cannot be entirely erased. It leaves traces, and from those traces, however faint, we can begin to reconstruct what was lost. The story of Carthage is, in the end, a story about memory and forgetting, about how civilizations are remembered and how they are lost. It is a story about the power of narrative, about who gets to tell the story and how it gets told. It is a story about the costs of empire, about the violence and destruction that empire building entails. It is a story about resilience and about the limits of resilience, about how far a people can be pushed before they break. And it is a story about individuals, about the choices they make and the constraints they face, about what one person can achieve and what no person can overcome alone. These are universal themes, as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. The specific circumstances of Carthage and Rome, of Hannibal and Scipio, are unique to their time and place, but the underlying dynamics, the patterns of rivalry and conflict, of ambition and tragedy, of memory and loss, these are timeless. And so the story of Carthage endures. It endures in the ruins that dot the Tunisian coastline. It endures in the accounts of ancient historians, however biased and incomplete. It endures in the works of the later writers and artists who have been inspired by the tale of Hannibal and his elephants, of Dido and her funeral pyre, of a great city brought low. It endures in the collective memory of Western civilization, as one of the foundational stories that have shaped how we understand power and conflict, victory and defeat, civilization and barbarism. And it endures as a reminder, a warning even, about what can be lost when empires clash, when hatred and fear overcome reason, when the decision is made not just to defeat an enemy, but to destroy them utterly. The Romans destroyed Carthage, but they could not destroy its memory. That memory haunts us still. The relationship between Carthage and Rome has often been compared to other great rivalries in history. The Athenians and the Spartans, the French and the British, the Americans and the Soviets. Each of these rivalries had its own character, its own causes, its own trajectory. But they all shared certain features. Two powerful states, competing for dominance, each seeing the other as an existential threat, each willing to commit enormous resources to the struggle. And in each case, the rivalry shaped both parties, defining their identities and their policies in opposition to each other. Rome defined itself against Carthage. The Punic Wars forged Rome into the military superpower it would become, teaching it how to wage war on a massive scale, how to mobilize its resources, how to endure catastrophic defeats and still prevail. Without Carthage, Rome might have remained a regional power in Italy. The struggle against Carthage forced Rome to expand, to innovate, to become more than it had been. In this sense, Carthage made Rome, and Rome, in destroying Carthage, defined the terms on which it would engage with the rest of the world for centuries to come. For Carthage, the relationship with Rome was equally defining, but in a darker way. Carthage did not choose this rivalry. It did not seek conflict with Rome, but once the conflict began, it consumed everything. The Punic Wars dominated Carthaginian politics and society for over a century. They drained Carthage's wealth, killed its youth, and ultimately destroyed its independence. Carthage fought with skill and courage and determination. It produced one of history's greatest generals. It achieved stunning victories. But it was not enough. Rome was simply too strong, too resilient, too determined, and in the end, Carthage paid the ultimate price. This asymmetry is worth noting. Rome was strengthened by its struggle with Carthage. It emerged from the Punic Wars as the dominant power in the Mediterranean, with the wealth and resources to build an empire that would last for centuries. Carthage was destroyed. The rivalry did not affect both parties equally. One thrived, one perished. This is often the nature of such conflicts. The stakes are not always the same for both sides, and the outcomes are not always proportionate to the effort expended. There is also a question of contingency, of how things might have been different. What if Hannibal had received the reinforcements he requested? What if Hasdrubal had reached Italy safely and linked up with his brother? What if Carthage had built a larger fleet during the Second Punic War and challenged Rome for control of the sea? What if the Carthaginian government had been more unified and more willing to support Hannibal's strategy? What if Rome, after Cannae, had sued for peace rather than fighting on? Any of these changes might have altered the outcome. The Second Punic War was closer than we sometimes think. Hannibal came very close to breaking Rome. If he had succeeded, the entire history of the Mediterranean, and indeed of Europe, would have been different. We would live in a world shaped not by Rome, but by Carthage. Latin would not be the ancestor of the Romance languages. Roman law would not be the foundation of the European legal systems. The Roman Empire, with all its achievements and all its crimes, would never have existed. It is a dizzying thought, a reminder of how contingent history is, how much depends on individual decisions and on chance. But we must also recognise that there were structural factors that made a Carthaginian victory difficult, perhaps impossible. Rome's manpower advantage, its geographical position, its political system, its alliance network, all of these gave Rome advantages that Carthage could not easily overcome. Hannibal's genius could win battles, but it could not fundamentally alter these structural realities. This is the tension between structure and agency in history, between the forces that constrain what is possible and the individuals who push against those constraints. History is shaped by both. Great individuals matter. Hannibal mattered. Without him, the Second Punic War would have been a very different conflict, probably a much shorter one. But individuals operate within systems, and those systems impose limits. Hannibal could not transform Carthage into Rome. He could not give Carthage the resources and advantages that Rome possessed. And so, despite his brilliance, despite his victories, he ultimately failed. This brings us back to the question of what we can learn from Carthage's story. Perhaps the most important lesson is about humility, about recognizing the limits of what any individual or any society can achieve. Carthage was a great civilization, wealthy and sophisticated with a long and proud history. But it was not invincible. It could be defeated. It could be destroyed. And all of its achievements, all of its accumulated knowledge and culture could be lost. This is true of every civilization, including our own. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is guaranteed. The systems and institutions we build, the knowledge we accumulate, the cultures we create, all of this is fragile. It can be destroyed by war, by natural disaster, by neglect, by the simple passage of time. The story of Carthage is a reminder to value what we have, to preserve it, to pass it on to future generations, and it is a reminder to be cautious about the use of force, about the pursuit of total victory, about the impulse to destroy those we see as enemies. Rome destroyed Carthage, and in doing so, Rome destroyed something valuable, something irreplaceable. The world is poorer for that loss. We should not repeat that mistake. There is also a lesson about the importance of perspective, about the need to question dominant narratives. For most of Western history, the story of Carthage has been told from the Roman perspective. Carthage was the enemy, the other, the barbarian. This narrative served Rome's purposes, and it was internalized by later European civilizations that saw themselves as heirs to Rome. But it is not the only possible narrative. If we could hear the Carthaginian side of the story, if we could read Carthaginian histories and Carthaginian literature, we would almost certainly see the conflict very differently. We would see Rome not as the defender of civilization, but as an aggressive, expansionist power, a threat to Carthage's security and prosperity. We would see the Punic Wars not as a necessary struggle against barbarism, but as a tragedy, a destructive conflict that neither side truly wanted, but that neither could avoid. We would see Hannibal not as a monster or even as a tragic hero, but as a man doing his duty, defending his homeland, fighting for his people. These perspectives are lost to us, but we can at least try to imagine them, to recognise that the history we have inherited is partial and biased. This is important not just for understanding Carthage, but for understanding history more generally. Every history is told from a particular perspective, shaped by particular interests and assumptions. To be a critical reader of history, we must always ask, whose story is this? Who is telling it, and why? What voices are missing? In the case of Carthage, the missing voices are those of the Carthaginians themselves. We hear about them only through their enemies. This is a profound loss, but it is not unique. Throughout history, many peoples and civilizations have been conquered, destroyed, or marginalized, and their stories have been told, if at all, by others. The history of the colonized, the conquered, the enslaved, the oppressed, these are stories that are often told from the perspective of the colonizers, the conquerors, the enslavers, the oppressors, and those perspectives are invariably distorted, shaped by the need to justify domination, to rationalize violence, to portray the other as inferior or barbaric. The story of Carthage is an early example of this dynamic, and it reminds us to be skeptical of historical narratives that demonize entire peoples or civilizations. When we encounter such narratives, we should ask what purpose they serve, what interest they advance, and what alternative stories might exist if we could hear from those who are silenced. The Carthaginian experience also speaks to the vulnerability of maritime and commercial powers. Carthage was built on trade, on the movement of goods across the sea. This made it wealthy and cosmopolitan, but it also made it vulnerable. When Rome cut off Carthage's trade routes, when it seized Carthage's colonies and disrupted its commercial networks, Carthage's power declined rapidly. A land-based power like Rome, with its agricultural base and its territorial empire, was more resilient. It could lose territory and recover. It could be blockaded and still feed itself. Carthage, dependent on the sea, on trade, on distant colonies, could not. This is a pattern we see repeated in history. Maritime empires, from the Phoenicians to the Dutch to the British, have been powerful and wealthy, but also vulnerable to disruption. When their trade routes are cut, when their colonies rebel, when new technologies or new powers challenge their dominance, they can decline with shocking rapidity. The story of Carthage is a cautionary tale for any power that bases its strength primarily on commerce and naval power. Such powers must also have a solid territorial base, reliable allies, and the ability to sustain themselves even when trade is disrupted. Another aspect of the Carthaginian story that deserves attention is the role of military innovation and adaptation. Both Carthage and Rome demonstrated remarkable ability to learn from their defeats and to adapt their tactics and strategies. Rome, faced with Carthaginian naval superiority, built a fleet and invented the corvus to turn naval battles into infantry battles. Hannibal, faced with Roman numerical superiority, perfected the art of the ambush and the encirclement, using superior tactics to defeat larger armies. Scipio Africanus, studying Hannibal's methods, learned to fight in the Carthaginian manner, using cavalry and manoeuvre to defeat the Carthaginians at their own game. This ability to innovate, to learn, to adapt, was crucial to the outcome of the Punic Wars. It was not just about resources or manpower, though those mattered. It was also about the willingness and ability to change, to abandon old methods that were not working, to experiment with new approaches. This is as true in modern warfare as it was in ancient warfare. The armies and nations that succeed are those that can adapt most quickly to new challenges and new technologies. The story of the Punic Wars also raises questions about the ethics of warfare and the laws of war. By modern standards, the conduct of both Rome and Carthage would be considered war crimes. Both sides engaged in massacres of civilians, in the torture and execution of prisoners, in the deliberate destruction of cities and the enslavement of populations. This was, in many ways, normal for ancient warfare. The concept of civilian immunity, of rules protecting non-combatants, of limits on the conduct of war. These are relatively modern ideas, products of centuries of moral and legal development. The ancient world did not operate under these constraints. War was total. The defeated could expect no mercy. Cities that resisted were sacked. Populations that rebelled were enslaved or killed. This was understood and accepted by both sides. But does that make it right? Or does it simply mean that the moral standards of the ancient world were inferior to our own? These are difficult questions, and there are no easy answers. We can recognize that ancient peoples operated under different moral frameworks without endorsing those frameworks. We can understand the context of ancient warfare without excusing the atrocities committed. And we can learn from the past using stories like that of Carthage to reflect on how far we have come and how far we still need to go in developing ethical constraints on the conduct of war. The destruction of Carthage is particularly troubling from an ethical standpoint. The Third Punic War was not a war of necessity. Carthage posed no credible threat to Rome. It was a client state, disarmed and dependent. The Roman decision to destroy Carthage was motivated by fear, by revenge, by greed for Carthaginian territory, and perhaps by a belief that only total destruction could ensure lasting security. This was, even by ancient standards, excessive. Some Romans recognized this at the time. Scipio Aemilianus, the general who oversaw the destruction of Carthage, reportedly wept as he watched the city burn, and he quoted lines from Homer's Iliad about the fall of Troy, recognizing that what he was witnessing was a tragedy, not just a victory. But he did not stop the destruction. He carried out his orders, and Rome, as a society, chose to embrace the destruction of Carthage as a necessary and even glorious act. Later Roman writers celebrated it as the final victory over Rome's greatest enemy, the end of a long and dangerous rivalry. Only a few voices, like that of the historian Polybius, expressed any ambivalence about what had been done. This raises a question that is still relevant today. How should we think about the destruction of enemy societies? Is it ever justified to not just defeat an enemy, but to destroy them utterly, to erase their culture and their identity? The Romans believed it was, at least in the case of Carthage. They believed that Carthage was an existential threat and that only complete destruction would ensure Roman security. But was this belief rational, or was it driven by fear and hatred? And even if the belief was rational, did it justify the methods? These are questions that every society engaged in conflict must grapple with. In the 20th century, we saw the horrors of genocide, of attempts to exterminate entire peoples. We developed international laws and norms to prevent such atrocities, but we have not always succeeded in enforcing those norms. Genocides have occurred since World War II, and they continue to occur. The story of Carthage, an early example of deliberate cultural and physical destruction, reminds us of how old and how persistent this impulse is, and how vigilant we must be in resisting it. The Punic Wars also had enormous consequences for the development of Roman society and culture. The wars transformed Rome from a regional Italian power into a Mediterranean empire. The wealth that flowed into Rome from its conquests, the slaves that were taken, the territories that were annexed, All of this fundamentally changed Roman society. The old republican virtues of moderation and civic duty began to erode as a new class of wealthy aristocrats emerged, men who had made fortunes from war and conquest. The influx of slaves displaced small farmers who could not compete with large estates worked by slave labour. These displaced farmers migrated to the cities, where they became a restless and politically volatile underclass. The social tensions created by the Punic Wars and their aftermath would eventually lead to the collapse of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Empire. In this sense, the Punic Wars were a turning point in Roman history, the beginning of the process that would transform Rome from a republic into an autocracy. Carthage, even in defeat, shaped Rome's future. The wars that destroyed Carthage also changed Rome, not always for the better. The wars also had a profound impact on Roman culture and literature. The memory of the Punic Wars, and particularly of Hannibal, became a central theme in Roman writing. Livy devoted several books of his monumental history of Rome to the Second Punic War, providing a detailed narrative that has been our primary source for the conflict. Polybius, a Greek historian who lived in Rome as a hostage, wrote an even more detailed account, motivated by a desire to explain to Greek readers how Rome had come to dominate the Mediterranean world in such a short time. For Polybius, the Punic Wars were the key event, the test that proved Rome's superiority. Virgil, in the Aeneid, wove the story of Dido and the founding of Carthage into the mythological origins of Rome, framing the conflict between Carthage and Rome as a cosmic destiny written in the stars. These works, and many others, ensured that the story of Carthage would be preserved and transmitted to future generations. But they also shaped how that story was understood, emphasizing Roman virtue and Carthaginian vice, Roman perseverance and Carthaginian treachery. The Romans wrote the history of the Punic Wars, and in doing so, they wrote Carthage's epitaph. One of the most enduring images from the Punic Wars is that of Hannibal crossing the Alps with his elephants. This moment has captured the imagination of countless generations, inspiring paintings, sculptures, poems, and more recently, films and novels. There is something inherently dramatic and romantic about the image. The great general, defying the impossible, leading his army over the highest mountains in Europe, bringing war elephants into a land that had never seen such creatures. It is an image of audacity and determination, of human will triumphing over nature. And it is true. Hannibal did cross the Alps. He did bring elephants. He did achieve what no one thought possible. But we should also remember the cost. Thousands of men died on those mountains. Most of the elephants died. The army that emerged into Italy was half the size of the army that entered the Alps, exhausted, sick, and depleted. The crossing of the Alps was an extraordinary achievement, but it was also a desperate gamble, born of strategic necessity. Hannibal had no choice. The sea route was blocked by Roman naval power. The land route through the Alps was the only way to reach Italy with an army, and so he took it, knowing the risks, knowing the cost, but believing that victory in Italy would make it all worthwhile. In the end, it did not. The crossing of the Alps was the high point of Hannibal's campaign, the moment when anything seemed possible. But it was also, in a sense, the beginning of the end. Hannibal reached Italy, but he could not conquer it, and the army he had brought at such cost slowly dwindled away over the years of campaigning, until there was nothing left but the legend. The elephants themselves deserve a moment of attention. War elephants were used by several ancient armies, particularly in the Hellenistic world following Alexander the Great's encounters with them in India. They were formidable weapons, capable of breaking enemy lines, terrifying horses and trampling infantry. But they were also difficult to control, vulnerable to panic, and required enormous resources to maintain. Each elephant needed hundreds of pounds of food per day. They needed experienced handlers, called mahouts. They needed to be trained for years before they were useful in battle, and they were vulnerable. A wounded or panicked elephant could turn on its own army, causing chaos. At the Battle of Zama, Hannibal's elephants were turned against him, and they contributed to his defeat. War elephants were in many ways the ancient equivalent of tanks, powerful, impressive, but with significant limitations. They were most effective as a psychological weapon, terrifying an enemy that had never encountered them. But once an enemy learned how to deal with them, their effectiveness declined. The Romans, after their initial encounters with Carthaginian elephants, developed tactics to counter them, and elephants ceased to be the decisive weapon they had once been. Still, the image of Hannibal's elephants crossing the Alps remains one of the most iconic in ancient history, a symbol of the extraordinary lengths to which he was willing to go to achieve victory. The figure of Hannibal has been interpreted and reinterpreted countless times over the centuries, and each era has seen in him something different. To the Romans, he was the great enemy, the embodiment of foreign threat. To medieval Europeans, he was a figure of legend, grouped with other great warriors of antiquity like Alexander and Julius Caesar. To Renaissance humanists, he was a tragic hero, a man of genius brought down by fate and by lesser men. To Enlightenment thinkers, he was an example of military science, and his campaigns were studied as models of strategic thinking. To Romantic poets and artists, he was a symbol of individual greatness, of the sublime and the tragic. To 19th century nationalists, he was a symbol of resistance against empire, a champion of a small nation against a great power. To 20th century military theorists, he was a master of operational art, and his battles were dissected for lessons applicable to modern warfare. And to contemporary audiences, in an age of post-colonial scholarship and critical re-examination of empire, Hannibal can be seen as a victim of Roman imperialism, a defender of his homeland against an aggressive invader. All of these interpretations contain some truth, but all are also shaped by the concerns and perspectives of their own times. The real Hannibal, the man as he actually was, remains elusive, hidden behind layers of interpretation and myth. What we can say with some confidence is that Hannibal was a brilliant military tactician, perhaps the most brilliant of the ancient world. His victories at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae are still studied as masterpieces of battlefield manoeuvre. He had an extraordinary ability to read terrain, to anticipate enemy movements, and to devise plans that exploited enemy weaknesses. He was also a leader who inspired fierce loyalty in his men, who could hold together an army of diverse nationalities and languages through years of hardship. These are remarkable qualities, and they explain why Hannibal's reputation has endured. But we should also remember that Hannibal, for all his genius, failed in his ultimate objective. He did not defeat Rome. He did not save Carthage. His strategy, brilliant though it was in conception, did not work. Why? Was it because the strategy was fundamentally flawed, based on incorrect assumptions about Roman resolve and the strength of the Roman alliance system? Was it because Hannibal was not adequately supported by his government? Was it because Rome simply had too many advantages, too much manpower, too much resilience? Or was it because, in the end, even genius has its limits, and some challenges cannot be overcome by individual brilliance alone? Probably it was a combination of all of these factors. Hannibal's failure was not his alone, it was a systemic failure, the failure of Carthage as a state to match Rome's organisational and demographic advantages. But the fact remains, Hannibal failed, and Carthage was destroyed. The Second Punic War is sometimes called Hannibal's War, and there is some justice to this. Hannibal dominated the conflict, shaped its course, and came to embody it in the Roman imagination. But we should not forget that it was a war between states, not a duel between individuals. Thousands of other people played crucial roles. Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's brother, who held Spain against the Romans for years and tried to march to Hannibal's aid. Maharbal, Hannibal's cavalry commander, who reportedly urged Hannibal to march on Rome immediately after Cannae. Scipio Africanus, the Roman general who learned from Hannibal and eventually defeated him. Fabius Maximus, the Roman dictator who understood that Rome could not beat Hannibal in battle, and devised the strategy of attrition that eventually wore him down. Massinissa, the Numidian king whose cavalry turned the tide at Zama, and countless others, soldiers and civilians, senators and slaves, who lived through the war and whose actions, large and small, shaped its outcome. History tends to focus on great individuals, on the Hannibals and the Scipios, because their stories are dramatic and because they make history easier to understand and to narrate. But history is made by societies, by institutions, by vast numbers of people acting and reacting to circumstances. The great individuals matter, but they do not act alone, and they cannot succeed alone. This brings us to a fundamental question about historical causation. What drives history? Is it great individuals with their vision and their will, or is it impersonal forces, economic systems, geographic constraints, technological developments, demographic trends? The debate between these two perspectives has been ongoing for centuries, and it is not likely to be resolved anytime soon. The truth is probably that both matter. Individuals can make a difference, but only within the constraints imposed by their circumstances. Hannibal's genius mattered. His decisions and his tactics changed the course of events, but he could not overcome the structural disadvantages that Carthage faced. Similarly, the rise of Rome was not just the product of a few great leaders, though Rome had many. It was the product of institutions, of a system of alliances, of a military culture, of geographic advantages. History is the interaction of agency and structure, of individuals and systems. To understand historical events, we need to pay attention to both. The legacy of Carthage in North Africa itself is complex and contested. Modern Tunisia, the nation-state that occupies the territory where Carthage once stood, has a complicated relationship with its Carthaginian past. Tunisia's dominant historical narrative has long emphasized its Arab and Islamic identity, tracing its history back to the Arab conquest of the 7th century CE and the spread of Islam across North Africa. The pre-Islamic past, including the Roman and the Carthaginian periods, has often been downplayed or treated as a foreign interlude, the history of colonizers rather than of the native Berber population. But in recent decades there has been a growing interest in reclaiming the Carthaginian heritage as part of Tunisian national identity. Some Tunisian intellectuals and activists have argued that Carthage represents an indigenous North African civilization, a pre-colonial African power that successfully resisted European, specifically Roman, imperialism for centuries. In this reading, Carthage becomes a symbol of African achievement and resistance, a source of pride rather than an embarrassing reminder of defeat. This reinterpretation is part of a broader movement across formerly colonized regions to reclaim pre-colonial histories and to challenge narratives that portrayed these histories as inferior or irrelevant. But this project faces challenges. The Carthaginians were themselves colonizers, descendants of Phoenician traders who established their city on land inhabited by Berber peoples. The relationship between Carthage and the indigenous populations of North Africa was complex, involving both cooperation and exploitation. Carthage recruited Berber soldiers for its armies, traded with Berber tribes, and sometimes allied with Berber kings. But Carthage also extracted tribute from the interior, suppressed rebellions, and treated the Berbers as subjects rather than equals. The mercenary war, in which Berber and Libyan troops rebelled against Carthage, is evidence of these tensions. So while Carthage can be claimed as an African civilization, it was not simply an indigenous one. It was a complex amalgam, Phoenician in origin, Hellenistic in culture, African in location, and cosmopolitan in character. Claiming Carthage as part of a national or regional identity requires grappling with these complexities, acknowledging both the achievements of Carthaginian civilization and the ways in which it was implicated in its own forms of domination and exploitation. The Phoenician heritage of Carthage is another dimension that complicates efforts to appropriate its legacy. The Phoenicians were a Semitic people, linguistically and culturally related to the ancient Hebrews and Arameans. Their homeland was in what is now Lebanon, and they established colonies across the Mediterranean, of which Carthage became the greatest. Some scholars and activists in modern Lebanon have embraced the Phoenician identity as a way of asserting a distinct Lebanese identity separate from the broader Arab world. In this reading, the Lebanese are the descendants of the Phoenicians, inheritors of a maritime and commercial tradition that stretches back thousands of years. Carthage, as the greatest Phoenician colony, becomes part of this Lebanese national narrative, but this claim is also contested. The modern population of Lebanon, like that of Tunisia, is the product of many migrations and mixings over thousands of years. To claim direct descent from the ancient Phoenicians is to oversimplify a complex ethnic and cultural history, and to claim Carthage as a Phoenician Lebanese achievement is to ignore the ways in which Carthage over centuries developed its own distinct identity, becoming something more than just a colony of Tyre. These competing claims on Carthaginian heritage reflect the ways in which ancient history is continually reinterpreted and appropriated to serve contemporary political and cultural purposes. The archaeological site of Carthage itself has been the subject of international attention and concern. In 1979, UNESCO designated the ruins of Carthage as a World Heritage Site, recognising their universal historical and cultural value. This designation has brought resources for preservation and excavation, but it has also raised questions about who owns and controls this heritage. Is Carthage the property of Tunisia, the nation on whose soil the ruins lie? Is it the property of the descendants of the Carthaginians, whoever they might be? Is it part of the common heritage of humanity, belonging to all people? UNESCO's designation implies the latter, but in practice, the Tunisian government controls access to the site and makes decisions about its preservation and interpretation. There have been tensions between international archaeologists who want to excavate and study the site according to Western academic standards, and Tunisian authorities who are concerned about issues of sovereignty and about ensuring that Carthage's story is told in a way that respects Tunisian national interests. These tensions are not unique to Carthage. They reflect broader debates about cultural heritage, about who has the right to study and interpret the past, and about the relationship between archaeology and colonialism. Western archaeology has often been complicit in colonialism, extracting artefacts and knowledge from colonised regions and bringing them back to museums and universities in Europe and North America. The movement to decolonise archaeology seeks to change this, to ensure that local communities have control over their own heritage, and that archaeological practice serves their interests as well as the interests of global scholarship. The story of Carthage also connects to contemporary debates about immigration and cultural diversity in the Mediterranean world. The ancient Mediterranean was a cosmopolitan space where people, goods, and ideas moved relatively freely across the sea. Carthage was a cosmopolitan city, home to Phoenicians, Greeks, Italians, Iberians, Africans, a melting pot of cultures and languages. This cosmopolitanism was a source of strength, allowing Carthage to draw on diverse talents and to connect distant regions through trade and exchange. But it was also, in the Roman telling, a source of weakness, a lack of unity and shared identity that made Carthage less cohesive than Rome. Today, as Europe and North Africa grapple with questions of migration, integration and identity, the example of ancient Carthage offers a historical perspective. It reminds us that the Mediterranean has always been a space of exchange and mixture, that cosmopolitanism is not a new phenomenon, and that diverse societies can be both strong and creative. But it also reminds us that such societies face challenges, that diversity can create tensions, and that building a cohesive political community from diverse populations requires effort and skill. These are not easy lessons, and they do not provide simple answers to contemporary problems, but they suggest that we should approach these problems with a sense of historical perspective, recognising that they are not new and that past societies have grappled with similar challenges. As we approach the end of this long journey through Carthaginian history, it is worth reflecting on what has been lost and what has been preserved. We have lost the Carthaginian perspective on their own history. We have lost their literature, their philosophy, their science. We have lost the voices of Carthaginian poets and historians, priests and merchants, mothers and soldiers. We have lost the full richness of their culture, the nuances of their society, the complexity of their beliefs. What remains are fragments, archaeological ruins, a few inscriptions, references in Greek and Roman texts, and the distorted image that their enemies created. From these fragments, scholars have painstakingly reconstructed a partial picture of what Carthage was, but it remains incomplete, and always will be. This incompleteness is itself a kind of lesson. It teaches us humility about what we can know of the past. It teaches us to be cautious in our judgments, to acknowledge uncertainty, to resist the temptation to fill in gaps with speculation presented as fact. And it teaches us about the fragility of memory, about how easily the past can be lost when records are destroyed, when oral traditions are broken, when languages die out. But something has been preserved, against all odds. The name of Carthage endures. The story of Hannibal endures. The memory of a great civilization that dared to challenge Rome endures. This memory has been shaped and reshaped by countless generations, each seeing in Carthage what it wanted or needed to see. But the fact that Carthage is remembered at all after 2,000 years, after the deliberate attempt to erase it from history, is itself significant. It suggests that the human desire to remember, to preserve the past, to tell stories about those who came before us, is stronger than the forces of destruction and forgetting. The Romans tried to destroy Carthage completely, and they very nearly succeeded. But they could not destroy the human fascination with Carthage, the sense that this was a story worth telling, a civilization worth remembering. And so Carthage lives on, not as a physical city, but as an idea, a symbol, a story. It lives on in the ruins that dot the Tunisian coast. It lives on in the accounts of ancient historians. It lives on in the works of poets and artists who have been inspired by its tale. And it lives on in efforts like this one, attempts to piece together from fragments and echoes what this civilization was and what it meant. The story of Carthage is ultimately a story about us, about humanity, about what we create and what we destroy, about what we remember and what we forget. It is a story about ambition, about the drive to build, to explore, to conquer, to achieve. It is a story about conflict, about the terrible costs of war, about what happens when great powers collide. It is a story about resilience, about the capacity to endure catastrophe and to rebuild. And it is a story about loss, about the impermanence of all human achievements, about how even the greatest civilizations can fall and be forgotten. These themes are timeless. They speak to fundamental aspects of the human condition, and that is why the story of Carthage, though it happened more than 2,000 years ago in a world vastly different from our own, still resonates today. We recognize ourselves in the Carthaginians, in their hopes and fears, in their struggles and defeats. We recognize ourselves in the Romans too, in their determination and their ruthlessness, in their triumphs and their crimes. The Punic Wars are not just ancient history, they are human history, and they have something to teach us about who we are and who we might become. As we close this exploration of Carthage, we must acknowledge what has been left unsaid, what remains unknown or contested. There are entire aspects of Carthaginian life that we have barely touched upon. The role of women in Carthaginian society, the daily life of ordinary Carthaginians, the details of Carthaginian art and music and cuisine, the structure of Carthaginian religious belief beyond the headline-grabbing issue of sacrifice. These gaps are not failures of scholarship, but reflections of the incompleteness of the evidence. Scholars work with what they have, and they do remarkable work piecing together understanding from limited sources. But there are limits to what can be known. Some questions will never be answered. Some aspects of Carthaginian civilization will remain forever mysterious. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps some mystery is appropriate for a civilization that was so thoroughly destroyed, so deliberately erased. The mystery of Carthage is part of its allure, part of what draws us to its story. We are fascinated by what has been lost, by the tantalizing glimpses of a great civilization that we can never fully recover. But we can honour Carthage by telling its story, by preserving what remains, by continuing to study and to learn. We can honour Carthage by rejecting the propaganda that portrayed it as barbaric and evil, by recognising the humanity of the Carthaginians, by acknowledging their achievements alongside their failings. We can honour Carthage by remembering that history is complex, that civilizations cannot be reduced to simple, moral categories of good and evil, that every society is a mixture of light and shadow. We can honour Carthage by learning from its story, by reflecting on the dynamics of conflict and empire, by thinking critically about power and its consequences. And we can honour Carthage by refusing to accept the victor's narrative uncritically, by always asking whose voice is missing, whose perspective has been silenced, whose story has been suppressed. The destruction of Carthage was not inevitable. At many points in the long rivalry between Carthage and Rome, different choices could have been made, different paths could have been taken. Peace might have been possible, coexistence might have been achieved, but it did not happen. Instead, one civilization destroyed another, and the world was diminished by that destruction. We cannot change the past. We cannot bring back Carthage, cannot restore what was lost, but we can remember. We can tell the story. We can ensure that the Carthaginians are not forgotten, that their civilization is not reduced to a footnote in the story of Rome's rise. We can insist that Carthage matters, that its history has value, that the Carthaginians were people worthy of our attention and our respect. This is what we owe to the past, and it is what we owe to ourselves. Because in remembering Carthage, in grappling with its complex and tragic story, we learn something about our own world, about our own time, about the enduring challenges and questions that face every human society. To walk through the ruins of Carthage today is to walk through layers of history, through the accumulated sediments of thousands of years. It is to stand at a crossroads of civilizations, a place where Phoenician traders met African kingdoms, where Greek merchants exchanged goods with Iberian warriors, where Roman legions came to destroy and then to rebuild. It is to contemplate the passage of time, the rise and fall of empires, the transience of power and glory. The stones of Carthage have seen so much. They witnessed the building of a great city, the departure of fleets to distant lands, the return of laden merchant ships, the debates of senators and the prayers of priests. They witnessed the arrival of Hannibal's army, the desperate preparations for war, the siege that lasted 3 years. They witnessed the final terrible days when Rome came with fire and sword, when the streets ran with blood, when the city that had stood for over 6 centuries was torn down stone by stone. And then they witnessed a new beginning, as Romans built on the ruins, as a new Carthage rose from the ashes of the old, as life continued, as it always does, even in the aftermath of catastrophe. The stones endure, the people pass, but the stories remain if we choose to preserve them, if we choose to pass them on. And so, across the vast distance of more than 2,000 years, we reach back to Carthage. We reach through the silence, through the gaps in the record, through the distortions of enemy propaganda. We reach toward a people who lived and loved and struggled, who built a civilization of remarkable achievement, who fought with courage and ingenuity against a more powerful foe, who ultimately lost everything. We cannot bring them back, we cannot speak with them, we cannot know them as they truly were. But we can remember them, we can honour their memory, we can tell their story, and in doing so we keep alive something that Rome tried to destroy. The city of Carthage is gone, its stones scattered, its people long since dust. But the idea of Carthage, the memory of Carthage, the story of Carthage, these cannot be destroyed as easily as stone and flesh. They live on, passed down through the generations, evolving and changing but never entirely disappearing. They live on in the works of historians and archaeologists who continue to study the ruins and the texts. They live on in the popular imagination, in novels and films and games that reimagine the Punic Wars for new audiences. They live on in academic debates about the nature of ancient empires, the ethics of warfare, the construction of historical narratives. They live on finally in efforts like this, in the telling and retelling of the Carthaginian story, in the insistence that this civilization mattered, that its loss was a tragedy, that it deserves to be remembered. The ships that once sailed from Carthage's great circular harbour are long gone, rotted away or burned, their crews dead for millennia. The markets that once bustled with traders from across the known world are silent, buried under earth and time. The temples where the Carthaginians prayed to Baal Hammon and Tanit are ruins, their gods forgotten by all but scholars. The walls that protected the city, walls so massive that 3 elephants could walk abreast on top of them, have been demolished, their stones carted away to build other structures. The libraries that contained the wisdom and literature of Carthage were burned, their contents lost forever. The people themselves, the Carthaginians who spoke Punic and called themselves the children of Canaan, are gone, their descendants scattered and assimilated into other cultures, their unique identity dissolved in the waters of time. All of this is lost, and it cannot be recovered. But it is not entirely gone. Echoes remain, shadows persist, fragments survive, and from these echoes and shadows and fragments we can glimpse something of what Carthage was, can appreciate something of what was lost when Rome destroyed it. The greatest tragedy of Carthage's destruction is not just that a city was razed, or that thousands died. Cities have been destroyed before and since. People have died in every war. The unique tragedy of Carthage is that an entire civilization, with its own language, its own literature, its own way of seeing the world, was deliberately erased. It was not just conquest. It was cultural genocide. It was the systematic attempt to remove a people and their culture from history, and it very nearly succeeded. If not for the Romans themselves, who ironically preserved the memory of their greatest enemy, even as they destroyed the reality, Carthage might have been completely forgotten. If not for the archaeologists who have painstakingly excavated the ruins, we would know almost nothing of how the Carthaginians actually lived. If not for the enduring fascination with Hannibal's story, the Carthaginians might have become a mere footnote, a forgotten people mentioned only in passing. But they have not been forgotten. They have been remembered, however imperfectly. And that memory is itself a form of resistance against the erasure that Rome intended. In remembering Carthage, we also remember something important about the nature of historical knowledge. History is not simply the past. It is the past as we understand it, as we reconstruct it from evidence, as we interpret it through the lens of our own concerns and perspectives. History is always incomplete. It is always contested. It is always being rewritten as new evidence emerges or as new questions are asked. The history of Carthage that we tell today is different from the history that was told a century ago, and it will be different again from the history that will be told a century from now. This is not a weakness. It is the nature of historical inquiry. We can never know the past completely or with absolute certainty. We can only approach it asymptotically, getting closer but never quite arriving, and this means that we must always remain humble about our knowledge, always willing to revise our understanding, always open to new evidence and new interpretations. The story of Carthage also teaches us about the power of narrative to shape reality. The Romans told a story about Carthage, a story of a barbaric, treacherous enemy that had to be destroyed for the security of civilization. And that story became reality, or rather it became the only reality that most people knew. For centuries, anyone who wanted to learn about Carthage had to read Roman sources, had to see Carthage through Roman eyes. The Carthaginian perspective was not available. It had been silenced, and so the Roman narrative became the official history, the accepted truth. Only in the modern era, with the development of critical historical methods and archaeological science, have scholars been able to interrogate that narrative, to question its assumptions, to look for evidence that might contradict it. And what they have found is that the Roman narrative was, at best, incomplete, and at worst, deliberately distorted. The Carthaginians were not monsters. They were people, with a sophisticated civilization that made significant contributions to the ancient world. This recovery of a more balanced perspective on Carthage is important not just for understanding ancient history, but for understanding how historical narratives work in general, how they can be used to justify violence and domination, and how they can be challenged and revised. There is a particular poignancy to the fact that we know so much about Carthage's destruction and so little about its flourishing. We know the details of the Third Punic War, of the siege, of the final battle in the streets, of the systematic demolition of the city. We have vivid accounts, recorded by eyewitnesses or by those who spoke to eyewitnesses. We can visualize the horror of those final days, but we have almost no comparable accounts of Carthage at its height, of what it was like to live in the city in the 3rd or 4th century BCE, when Carthaginian ships sailed to every corner of the Mediterranean, when the markets were full of exotic goods, when the city was wealthy and powerful and secure. We can infer some things from archaeology, from the remains of buildings and artifacts, but we do not have the personal accounts, the diaries or letters or memoirs that would bring that world to life. We know much more about how Carthage died than about how it lived, and this imbalance in our knowledge is itself a consequence of Rome's victory. The victors recorded their triumph, the vanquished left no record, yet even in the absence of Carthaginian voices, we can try to imagine what life in Carthage might have been like. We can picture the harbour at dawn, with ships preparing to sail, sailors loading cargo, merchants arguing over prices, the air filled with the smells of pitch and salt water, and the exotic spices and perfumes being loaded onto ships bound for distant ports. We can imagine the residential districts, with their multi-storey houses built around central courtyards, where families gathered in the cool of the evening, where children played and where elders told stories of the city's founding and its heroes. We can imagine the temples, where priests performed elaborate rituals, where worshippers brought offerings of grain and wine and incense, where the sacred fire burned perpetually in honour of the gods. We can imagine the Senate House, where the leading citizens debated policy, voted on laws, sent ambassadors to foreign courts, made decisions that would affect the lives of millions across the empire. We can imagine the markets, vast open spaces filled with stalls selling everything imaginable, grain from Sicily, olive oil from Africa, wine from Iberia, glass from the Levant, purple dye from the murex snails that gave Phoenicia its name, slaves from Gaul and Numidia, ivory from deep in the African interior, tin from distant Britain, amber from the frozen north. We can imagine the streets, narrow and winding, lined with shops and workshops, where artisans crafted jewellery and pottery and bronze goods, where bakers baked bread and butchers sold meat, where wine shops and taverns offered refreshment to workers and travellers. We can imagine, too, the diversity of Carthage, the mixture of peoples and languages. A Carthaginian citizen of pure Phoenician descent might pass in the street a Libyan merchant, a Greek scholar, an Iberian mercenary, an Egyptian priest, a Numidian horse trader, an Italian sailor. They might speak different languages, worship different gods, dress in different styles, but they all called Carthage home, at least for a time. This cosmopolitanism, this openness to the world, was one of Carthage's great strengths. It allowed the city to draw on the talents and resources of many peoples. It made Carthage a centre of exchange, not just of goods, but of ideas and technologies. But it may also have been, as the Romans claimed, a source of weakness, a lack of the strong common identity that bound Rome and its Italian allies together. Whether this is true or simply Roman propaganda is difficult to say. What is clear is that Carthage was a different kind of society from Rome, organised on different principles, with different values and priorities, and that difference, perhaps, helps explain why the two powers could not coexist, why their rivalry became so intense, why one had to destroy the other. The religious life of Carthage remains one of the most controversial and least understood aspects of the civilization. The accusations of child sacrifice have overshadowed other aspects of Carthaginian religion. But we should remember that religion in ancient Carthage, as elsewhere in the ancient world, was about much more than sacrifice. It was about maintaining the favour of the gods, about ensuring the prosperity of the city, about marking the important moments in the life of individuals in the community. The Carthaginians built temples, celebrated festivals, performed rituals, consulted oracles, made offerings, prayed for blessings and protection. Their religion was woven into every aspect of daily life, from the small household shrine where a family might make daily offerings to the great public temples, where the entire city gathered for major festivals. The gods of Carthage, Baal-Hamon, the lord of the sky, Tanit, the mother goddess, Melkart, the patron of sailors and merchants, Eshmun, the god of healing, were not distant or abstract. They were active participants in the life of the city, and maintaining their favour was a civic duty as well as a personal responsibility. To understand Carthage, we would need to understand its religion, but this is precisely what we cannot do, at least not fully, because the religious texts, the prayers and hymns and theological treatises are lost. The question of child sacrifice deserves careful consideration, precisely because it has been used so effectively to portray the Carthaginians as barbaric. The evidence comes primarily from hostile Greek and Roman sources, which had obvious motivations to portray Carthage in the worst possible light. But there is also archaeological evidence from the Tophet, the sacred precinct where the urns containing the cremated remains of infants were buried. Thousands of these urns have been found, along with inscribed stones indicating that they were offerings to the gods. The question is, were these children sacrificed or did they die of natural causes and then receive special burial rites? The debate continues among scholars. Some argue that the inscriptions explicitly refer to sacrifice, using terminology that indicates these were offerings made in fulfillment of vows. Others argue that infant mortality in the ancient world was extremely high, and that the Tophet was simply a cemetery for babies who died in the first days or months of life. Children who were given special burial because they died before they were fully integrated into the family or community. Still others suggest that both interpretations may be partially correct, that the Tophet contained both children who died naturally and children who were sacrificed in times of extreme crisis. Without contemporary Carthaginian explanations of their own practices, we cannot know for certain. What we can say is that the practice, whatever it was not unique to Carthage. Similar sites have been found in other Phoenician colonies, suggesting that this was part of a broader Phoenician religious tradition, not a Carthaginian aberration. We must also be careful not to judge ancient peoples by modern moral standards. Every ancient civilization engaged in practices that we would find abhorrent today. The Greeks and Romans practiced slavery on a massive scale, treated women as property, exposed unwanted infants to die, entertained themselves with gladiatorial combat and public executions. The Aztecs practiced human sacrifice on a scale that dwarfed anything the Carthaginians might have done. The point is not to excuse these practices, but to recognise that moral standards change over time and that we cannot understand ancient societies if we simply apply our own values and condemn them for failing to meet standards they never claim to uphold. We can acknowledge that child sacrifice, if it occurred, was wrong by our standards, while also recognising that the Carthaginians who practiced it believed they were fulfilling their religious duties, ensuring the favour of the gods, protecting their city and their families. Context and understanding do not equal approval. We can seek to understand without condoning. The economic system of Carthage was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Carthage was one of the first societies to develop a true market economy, where prices were determined by supply and demand rather than by tradition or decree. Carthaginian merchants travelled vast distances, taking risks, investing capital, seeking profits. They developed complex financial instruments, including forms of credit and insurance. They standardized weights and measures to facilitate trade. They minted coins, which served both as a medium of exchange and as a tool of propaganda, with images of gods, heroes, and symbols of Carthaginian power stamped on them. The Carthaginian economy was, in many ways, proto-capitalist, based on private enterprise and the pursuit of profit. This was very different from the Roman economy, which was more agrarian and less commercialised, at least in the early period. The economic differences between Carthage and Rome mirrored and reinforced the political differences. Carthage was a merchant republic, where wealth was derived from trade and where political power was held by those who controlled commerce. Rome was a landowning republic, where wealth was derived from agriculture and where political power was held by those who owned land. These different economic bases led to different values, different priorities, different ways of organising society, and these differences ultimately may have contributed to the conflict between them. The artistic legacy of Carthage, what little survives, reveals a culture that was eclectic and cosmopolitan. Carthaginian art drew on many influences: Phoenician, Egyptian, Greek, African. Carthaginian craftsmen created beautiful jewellery in gold and silver, often featuring intricate filigree work and inlaid precious stones. They carved ivory into delicate figurines and decorative panels. They made glass beads and amulets that were traded across the Mediterranean. They painted pottery with geometric and floral designs. They carved stone stelae with images of gods and worshippers and with inscriptions in the Punic language. The style of this art was distinctive, a blend of influences that reflected Carthage's position as a crossroads of civilizations. But the art that survives is primarily small objects, portable goods. The monumental art, the great statues and relief sculptures that must have adorned Carthage's temples and public buildings, is lost. It was destroyed when the city was razed, or it was carried off as loot by the Romans. We know from ancient descriptions that Carthage had impressive public monuments, but we have very few of them. Once again, we see the pattern. The small portable objects survive because they were buried or discarded. The great public works are gone, deliberately destroyed. The language of Carthage, Punic, was a dialect of Phoenician, and it belonged to the Semitic language family. Punic was written in an alphabet derived from the Phoenician alphabet, which in turn was the ancestor of the Greek, Latin, and ultimately modern European alphabets. The Phoenicians' gift of the alphabet to the world is one of their most important contributions to human civilization. The alphabet made writing accessible to a much broader segment of society than the complex cuneiform or hieroglyphic systems used in Mesopotamia and Egypt. It allowed for easier record keeping, for the spread of literacy, for the preservation and transmission of knowledge. The alphabet that we use today to write these words is a direct descendant of the alphabet that the Carthaginians used to write Punic. In this sense, every time we write, we are using a technology that the Carthaginians and their Phoenician ancestors helped develop. But the Punic language itself is dead. It ceased to be spoken sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era, displaced by Latin, and later by Arabic. A few words of Punic survive in Latin, borrowed by the Romans and incorporated into their language. A few Punic inscriptions have been found and translated, giving us a small window into the language. But we have no Punic literature, no extended texts that would allow us to understand the full richness and complexity of the language. This too is part of the loss of Carthage. The military system of Carthage was, as we have discussed, based primarily on hired professional soldiers rather than citizen militias. This system had advantages and disadvantages. The advantages were flexibility, skill, and the ability to wage war without depleting the citizen population. The disadvantages were cost, reliability, and the lack of the deep patriotic motivation that drove citizen armies. Carthaginian generals had to be skilled not just in tactics, but in managing diverse multilingual armies held together by pay and personal loyalty, rather than by love of country. The best Carthaginian generals, like Hamilcar Barca and his son Hannibal, excelled at this. They built personal relationships with their troops, fought alongside them, shared their hardships, and rewarded them generously. They earned loyalty through leadership rather than through appeals to patriotism. But not all Carthaginian generals were as skilled, and when a Carthaginian army was defeated, when pay ran short, when a rival offered better terms, mercenaries could and did switch sides. The mercenary war showed the danger of this system taken to its extreme. Yet despite these risks, Carthage continued to rely on mercenaries throughout its history, suggesting that the Carthaginian elite saw this as preferable to arming and training a citizen militia, which might have posed a threat to their own power. The naval technology of Carthage was the most advanced in the Mediterranean for centuries. Carthaginian warships, particularly the quinquereme, were marvels of engineering. These were large, fast and manoeuvrable vessels, propelled by 5 banks of oars and capable of carrying marines and boarding parties, as well as being armed with the deadly bronze rams that could shatter the hull of an enemy ship. Building these ships required sophisticated knowledge of naval architecture, skilled shipwrights, and access to timber, bronze, and other materials. Maintaining a fleet required permanent infrastructure: shipyards, covered docks, repair facilities, and the famous circular military harbour at Carthage, the Kothon, which could shelter and maintain over 200 vessels. The Carthaginian navy was a permanent professional force, not a militia that was assembled only in times of war. This gave Carthage an enormous advantage over most other ancient powers, which lacked the resources or the expertise to build and maintain comparable fleets. Rome eventually matched Carthage at sea, but it took enormous effort and the copying of Carthaginian designs to do so, and even then, Rome never quite matched the seamanship and naval expertise of the Carthaginians. What Rome had instead was sheer persistence, and the willingness to absorb losses and rebuild. Rome lost entire fleets to storms and to Carthaginian attack, but it kept building new ones. Eventually, through sheer weight of numbers and resources, Rome achieved naval parity and then superiority. But for centuries before that, Carthage ruled the waves. The relationship between Carthage and the indigenous Berber populations of North Africa was complex and evolved over time. In the early period, Carthage was simply one coastal city among many, and its control over the interior was limited. But as Carthage grew in power, it extended its control inland, subjugating or allying with Berber tribes. The Carthaginians extracted tribute from the interior in the form of grain, livestock and recruits for their armies. Some Berber tribes allied willingly with Carthage, seeing advantages in the relationship. Others resisted and were conquered by force. The Berber kingdoms of Numidia, to the west of Carthage, maintained an ambiguous relationship with the city, sometimes allied, sometimes hostile. During the Second Punic War, different Numidian kingdoms took different sides, with Syphax supporting Carthage and Massinissa eventually allying with Rome. Massinissa's support was crucial to Rome's victory at Zama, and afterwards, Rome rewarded him with expanded territory at Carthage's expense. In the decades leading up to the Third Punic War, Massinissa continually encroached on Carthaginian territory, provoking the conflict that gave Rome its pretext for the final war. The Berber peoples thus played a significant role in the Punic Wars, though their perspective is even more absent from the historical record than that of the Carthaginians. After the destruction of Carthage, the Berber kingdoms of North Africa continued to exist for several more centuries, eventually being absorbed into the Roman Empire and later re-emerging as important kingdoms during the decline of Roman power. The agricultural techniques developed in Carthaginian North Africa were among the most advanced in the ancient world. The Carthaginians, drawing on Phoenician knowledge and adapting it to the African environment, developed sophisticated methods of irrigation, crop rotation and soil management. They cultivated olives, grapes, grain, and a variety of other crops with impressive efficiency. The treatise on agriculture by Maso the Carthaginian was so highly regarded that the Romans, after destroying Carthage, ordered it translated into Latin. It became one of the foundational texts of Roman agricultural science, influencing farming practices throughout the Roman Empire. This is a fascinating irony. The Romans destroyed Carthaginian civilization, but they preserved and learned from Carthaginian agricultural knowledge. The Roman willingness to adopt useful knowledge from conquered peoples, even peoples they despised, was one of Rome's strengths. It allowed Rome to incorporate the best practices and technologies of the many civilizations it conquered, creating a syncretic culture that drew on many sources. Carthaginian agricultural techniques, mediated through Mago's treatise, thus survived the destruction of Carthage and contributed to the productivity of Roman North Africa, which became one of the most important grain-producing regions of the empire, the breadbasket that fed Rome itself. The question of what might have happened if Carthage had won the Punic Wars is, of course, unanswerable, but it is worth contemplating. If Hannibal had succeeded in breaking the Roman alliance system, if Rome had been forced to accept peace on Carthaginian terms, the entire subsequent history of the Mediterranean would have been different. Carthage, not Rome, would have been the dominant power. The Mediterranean might have remained a multilingual, multicultural space, with Punic as a lingua franca rather than Latin. The spread of Greek culture might have taken different forms, mediated through Carthage rather than through Rome. The monotheistic religions that emerged from the eastern Mediterranean, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, might have spread differently or not at all. Europe might have developed very differently, without the unifying influence of the Roman Empire and Roman law. It is dizzying to contemplate the possibilities. Of course, Carthage did not win. Rome did, and the world we live in is, to a significant degree, shaped by that outcome. The languages we speak, the laws we follow, the political concepts we use, much of this traces back to Rome. A Carthaginian victory would have produced a fundamentally different world, one we cannot really imagine because we do not have the Carthaginian perspective, the Carthaginian culture to draw on. This is yet another loss resulting from the destruction of Carthage. We lost not just what Carthage was, but what it might have become, the alternate future that was foreclosed when Rome destroyed the city. As we reach the end of this long exploration, we return to where we began, to the question of memory and loss. The story of Carthage is preserved, but imperfectly. It is told, but from a particular perspective. It is remembered, but incompletely. And yet, despite all the limitations and all the losses, the story endures. It endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It speaks to the ambition to build something great, to create a civilization that will endure. It speaks to the tragedy of conflict, of how rivalries escalate, of how wars destroy what they claim to protect. It speaks to the resilience of human beings, their capacity to endure hardship, to fight against impossible odds. to refuse to surrender even when defeat seems certain. And it speaks to the impermanence of all human achievements, to the humbling reality that even the greatest civilizations can fall, can be destroyed, can be forgotten. These are lessons that every generation needs to learn anew, and the story of Carthage is one way of teaching them. The merchants who sailed from Carthage's harbours, who braved storms and pirates to carry their goods across the Mediterranean, who built fortunes and established colonies in distant lands, they are gone. The senators who debated in Carthage's Senate House, who made the decisions of peace and war, who governed an empire that stretched from Libya to Spain, they are gone. The generals who led Carthaginian armies, who outmaneuvered enemies on battlefields from Sicily to Italy, who crossed the Alps and defeated Rome's legions, they are gone. The priests who tended the sacred fires, who made offerings to Baal Hammon and Tanit, who mediated between the gods and the people, they are gone. The artisans who crafted beautiful objects, the farmers who worked the fields, the sailors who crewed the ships, the mothers who raised children, the children who played in the streets, all are gone. The language they spoke is dead. The gods they worshipped are forgotten. The city they built is ruins. 2,000 years have passed, and nothing remains but fragments and memories. And yet we remember. We tell the story. We study the ruins. We debate the meaning. We try to understand. And in doing so, we keep something alive. Not Carthage as it was. That is lost forever. But Carthage as an idea, as a symbol, as a reminder of what was and what was lost. The Romans intended to erase Carthage from history, to destroy it so completely that it would be as if it had never existed. They failed. Carthage survives, not as a physical place, but as a story, a memory, a presence in human consciousness. As long as we continue to tell this story, as long as we continue to remember, Carthage is not entirely dead. It lives on in the telling. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all we can hope for. That when we are gone, when our civilizations have fallen, when our languages are dead and our gods forgotten, someone will remember us. Someone will tell our story. Someone will try to understand who we were and what we meant. This is what we do for Carthage, and this is what we hope future generations will do for us. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through the history of Carthage, from its founding by Phoenician colonists to its final destruction by Rome, from its rise as a maritime empire to its tragic fall, from the genius of Hannibal to the ruins that remain today. We have explored the rise and fall of a great civilization, examined the causes and consequences of one of history's most famous conflicts, and reflected on the themes of power and loss, memory and forgetting, that make this story relevant even now, more than 2 millennia after the events themselves. The story of Carthage is a story of human ambition and human tragedy, of great achievements and terrible costs, of what we create and what we destroy. It is a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing on to future generations. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.